Welcome to Free Science Fiction Stories. Today is a 6-story military science fiction compilation from my Whistler War setting. Thank you for listening. Apollo's Fury.
The slums near the spire were a wasteland of shattered ambition. Once a thriving urban hub, now the twisted remains of buildings, scavenged metal, and crumbled roads sprawled in chaotic ruin. The spire rose defiantly in the distance, a needle of steel and glass piercing the ash-gray sky. It was humanity's last symbol of defiance, a fortress standing against the darkness that had spread across Earth. The slums below were its shield, a labyrinth of destruction where survivors scraped by under constant threat from the Whistlers. Aliens bend of the slow disassembly of humanity's accomplishments and humans themselves. Between the ruins, 3 Apollo-class mechs stood as pillars of resilience. Their armor bore the scars of countless skirmishes, scorched plating, jagged dents, and the faint glow of damaged circuitry barely holding together. The pilots inside them were the last line of defense, guardians of a city on the brink. Max's Apollo mech surged forward, its heavy steps shaking the ground as it charged the massive alien creature. The megabug, nearly equal in size to the mech, was a nightmare of jagged black chitin, serrated claws, and glowing green eyes that burned with malevolent hunger. Its mandibles clacked as it lunged, the sound like bones snapping under pressure. Max ducked low, his mech's servos whining as he sidestepped the bug's attack. In one fluid motion he brought his sword, a gleaming 2-ton slab of alloyed steel, up in a brutal arc. The blade pierced the megabug's throat, slicing through its reinforced carapace in a shower of bioluminescent gore. The creature thrashed, its spiked legs clawing at Max's mech, trying to find purchase. "Hold still," Max growled through gritted teeth. He twisted the blade, the bug's screeches turning into a grotesque gurgle. Without hesitation, he ignited his mech's flamethrowers, bathing the creature in a torrent of searing fire. The smell of burning chitin filled the air, and the bug collapsed, its body convulsing as it was reduced to a smoldering husk. "Kill confirmed," Max muttered, breathing heavily as he withdrew his blade. "Was that really necessary, Max?" Jill's voice cut through the comms, sharp and reprimanding. Her mech, standing 100 meters away, loomed with shoulder-mount missile pods locked and ready. The rifle in her mech's hands scanned the wreckage for any remaining threats. "You just wasted half your fuel reserves on a bug that was already dying." "Necessary?" Max shot back, maneuvering his mech into a defensive stance. "Yes, it was necessary. I saved you from having to fire another one of those expensive rockets." "Don't be reckless," Jill snapped. "We can't afford to lose another mech because you want to show off. Stick to the plan." Max grunted but said nothing, his frustration evident in the way his mech moved. Even behind all that steel, it was hard to mask body language. From his perch atop a ruined chunk of skyscraper, Will broke the tension. "If you two are done bickering, I've got movement on the east side. Recon drones picking up something big. Might be another megabug." Jill refocused immediately. "Details?" "Still processing," Will replied, his voice calm and precise, a stark contrast to Max's brashness. "It's faint, but there's a radiation spike. Looks like one of the bigger ones is scrambling sensors again." Jill clenched her fists inside her cockpit. The radiation signature was a telltale sign of the megabugs. They didn't just attack, they disrupted everything around them, worse than a regular Whistler swarm, making it nearly impossible to rely on high-quality sensor data. The team regrouped, their mechs forming a loose defensive line. Max's battered mech took point, his blade still dripping with alien ichor. Jill's missile-equipped mech stood in the center, its targeting system scanning for threats. Above them, Will's long-range sniper mech provided overwatch, its railgun gleaming ominously in the muted sunlight filtering through the haze. "Drone's got a visual," Will said, his voice tightening. "It's not just one. We've got multiple contacts, and they're heading straight for the spire." Jill's heart sank. The spire was more than just a structure. It was the nerve center of human civilization in this region. If the bugs reached it, there wouldn't be a second chance to push them back. "All right, team," she said, her voice firm and commanding. "We intercept. Max, you're on point. Will, keep eyes on the swarm and take out priority targets. I'll provide cover fire. Watch your surroundings. They love to use these debris fields against us." "Copy that," Max said, his tone more focused now. "Understood," Will added, his railgun already shifting to track the incoming threats. The trio moved as one, their mechs navigating the uneven terrain of the slums with practiced ease. The ground was littered with rubble, shattered glass, and the skeletal remains of buildings that once housed thousands. Every shadow, every crevice felt like a potential ambush point. The silence was deafening, broken only by the hum of their mechs' power cords and the distant rustle of shifting debris. Max's grip tightened on his controls as he scanned the wreckage ahead. His instincts, honed from countless battles, told him the enemy was close. "Stay sharp," Jill said, her voice low. "They're here, I can feel it." A piercing whistle echoed through the slums, a haunting, alien sound that sent a shiver down Jill's spine. It was followed by a low rumble, the ground trembling as something massive moved beneath them. "They're burrowing," Will said, his voice tense. "Brace yourselves." The team barely had time to react before the ground erupted in a shower of dirt and concrete. A second megabug, larger and more grotesque than the first, emerged with a shriek that rattled their teeth. Its glowing eyes locked onto the mechs, and it charged, its spiked legs tearing through the rubble with blinding speed. "Engage," Jill shouted. Max roared as he raised his sword, charging to meet the creature head-on. Behind him, Jill's missiles locked onto the target, and Will's railgun lined up for the perfect shot. The megabug lunged at Max's mech, its serrated claws flashing like guillotines. Max sidestepped, his servos groaning under the strain as the bug's claws slammed into the ground, sending a shockwave through the debris-strewn streets. Dust and rubble exploded into the air, momentarily obscuring his vision. "That thing's faster than it looks," Max growled, bringing his sword around in a wide arc. The blade sliced into the creature's exoskeleton, spraying glowing green ichor, but the bug barely flinched. Instead it reared back, its massive mandibles snapping inches from Max's cockpit. "Max, disengage," Jill barked over the comms, her targeting system locking onto the bug's exposed flank. "Missiles incoming." Max pushed his mech into a backward roll just as Jill's shoulder-mount missiles fired. The rockets streaked through the haze, slamming into the bug with deafening explosions. Chunks of its blackened carapace flew off, revealing pulsing bioluminescent tissue underneath. But the megabug wasn't done. It let out an ear-splitting screech and charged again, forcing Jill to retreat. "This thing's not going down easy," she muttered, her rifle spitting 30mm rounds into the beast as it closed the distance. From his elevated position in the ruins of a crumbling skyscraper, Will lined up a shot with his railgun. The weapon hummed ominously as it charged, locking onto the megabug's exposed flesh. "Hold it steady," he murmured to himself, waiting for the perfect moment. Below, Max and Jill danced around the creature, their mechs moving in coordinated bursts to keep it distracted. "Fire!" Jill shouted as she unleashed another barrage of missiles, forcing the bug to rear up. That was the opening Will needed. He pulled the trigger, and the railgun fired with a supersonic boom, sending a hypervelocity round streaking toward the target. The shot hit home, punching through the bug's exposed midsection and blowing a massive hole through its body. The creature let out one final choked screech before collapsing in a heap of shattered limbs and glowing viscera. "Target neutralized," Will said, exhaling slowly as he scanned for additional threats. "But I'm picking up movement. Lots of it." Before the team could regroup, a new sound filled the air, a chorus of shrill whistles. From the surrounding ruins, dozens of smaller whistlers emerged, their spindly bodies swarming over the debris like a tide of nightmares. "They're everywhere," Max shouted, his sword cleaving through a group of the creatures as they rushed him. "Watch your flanks." Jill's missiles rained down on the swarm, obliterating clusters of whistlers and carving temporary safe zones around the mechs. But for every group destroyed, more seemed to take their place, pouring out of the ruins and advancing relentlessly toward the spire. As if the ground assault wasn't enough, another of the megabugs appeared on a rooftop, its spiked legs gripping the structure like a predator stalking its prey. This one was different. It had large, translucent wings that shimmered in the dim light. With a powerful leap, it launched itself into the air, gliding toward Jill's mech with deadly intent. "Jill, above you," Will warned, lining up his railgun for another shot. She turned just in time to see the gliding megabug descending on her. She fired her rifle upward, rounds slamming into the creature's wings, but it twisted mid-air with supernatural agility, evading most of the shots. Its claws slashed at her mech, leaving deep gouges in the armor. Will's railgun fired again, the shot grazing one of the bug's wings and sending it spiraling out of control. The creature crashed into a nearby building, but instead of retreating, it scrambled back onto its legs and charged at Jill. "Max, I need support," Jill shouted, her mech backing away as she unloaded her rifle into the advancing bug. "I'm on it," Max roared, his mech surging forward. With a powerful leap, he brought his sword down on the creature's back, driving the blade deep into its carapace. The bug thrashed violently, throwing Max off, but Jill seized the opportunity. Her missiles fired at point-blank range, reducing the creature to a smoking ruin. The battle escalated as two more megabugs entered the fray. One had long, whip-like appendages that crackled with energy, lashing out at anything in its path. The other was armed with missile-like spikes that it launched from its thorax, each one capable of punching through armor. The whip bug struck first, its tendrils wrapping around Max's mech and pulling him off balance. Sparks flew as the whips tightened, crushing the mech's arm joints. Max struggled to free himself, but the creature was relentless, dragging him closer. "Hold on," Jill shouted, her rifle barking as she targeted the whip bug. The rounds tore into the creature's body, forcing it to release Max, but not before one of its tendrils struck Jill's mech, sending her crashing into a pile of rubble. The spike-shooter bug took advantage of the chaos, launching a volley of projectiles at Will's position. The railgun mech barely dodged in time, the spikes shredding the building he was using as cover. "I can't get a clear shot with these things pinning me down," Will said, his voice tight with frustration. Jill's mech struggled to its feet, battered but functional. "We need to split them up," she said. "Max, take the whip bug. Will, focus on that spike shooter. I'll handle the swarm." Max didn't hesitate. Igniting his flamethrowers, he charged the whip bug, using the flames to keep its tendrils at bay. The creature recoiled, its movements erratic as it tried to avoid the fire. Max seized the moment, driving his sword into its core and twisting until the bug collapsed. Meanwhile, Will repositioned his mech, using a drone to distract the spike shooter. As the creature focused on the decoy, Will lined up his railgun and fired. The shot pierced the bug's head, igniting its fluids in a burst of green fire. Jill, surrounded by smaller whistlers, fought valiantly. Her missiles and rifle tore through the swarm, but her mech was taking heavy damage. Just as one of the creatures leapt onto her cockpit, Max's mech appeared, cleaving the bug in two with a single swing of his blade. "Thanks," Jill said, her voice strained. "Any time," Max replied, panting as his mech's systems flagged critical damage. "Will!" Jill shouted, her mech rushing to cover him. "Status!" "Railgun's down, legs are shot," Will replied, his voice strained. "I'm out of the fight." Before Jill could respond, the whip bug made its final move. With its remaining tendrils, it lashed out at Max, pinning his mech against a collapsed building. Sparks flew as the tendrils crushed his armor, and warning sirens blared inside his cockpit. "I'm not done yet," Max roared, driving his sword into the bug's head. The creature let out a guttural screech, but its grip didn't loosen. Jill acted quickly, firing a barrage of missiles at the whip bug. The projectiles struck true, obliterating the creature and freeing Max. But the blast also sent his mech crashing to the ground. Smoke and sparks poured from its joints, and Max's comms went silent. "Max, respond," Jill said, panic creeping into her voice. After a tense moment, Max's voice crackled through the comms. "Still here," he said, coughing, "but my mech's done." Jill looked at the ruins around them, the bodies of the megabugs scattered amidst the rubble. The cost of their victory was written in the damage to their mechs and the toll on their team. But the spire still stood, and humanity's fragile foothold had been defended. For now, the battlefield was a smoking ruin, the twisted remains of mechs and alien bodies scattered amidst the rubble of the slums. The missile bug, the last of the megabugs, screeched as it attempted to retreat, its jagged abdomen sparking with damage. Jill refused to let it escape. "Max, can you move?" she called over the comms, her voice steady despite the exhaustion. Max's battered mech limped forward, its servos whining with every step. His sword arm hung uselessly, but his flamethrowers were still operational. "Barely," he replied, his voice strained. "But I've got one last shot." Jill fired a burst from her 30mm rifle, shredding the bug's rear legs and forcing it to collapse. As the creature struggled to rise, Max staggered closer and unleashed a torrent of flames, engulfing it in a searing inferno. The bug writhed, its bioluminescent blood splattering everywhere, before finally going still. Jill scanned the battlefield from her cockpit, her mech's systems running on emergency power. Max's mech stood motionless, its frame scorched and armor shredded. Warning lights blinked erratically across its surface, and the cockpit hatch hissed open. Max tumbled out, collapsing onto the ground. "Max!" Jill shouted, quickly dismounting her mech and rushing to his side. His face was pale, blood trickling from a gash across his face. "Stay with me," she urged, checking his vitals. Max managed a weak grin. "Told you I had one last shot," he said before coughing violently. His voice was faint, but the stubborn determination in his eyes was still there. Meanwhile, Will's sniper mech stood slumped against a crumbling wall, its legs twisted and railgun cracked from the earlier ambush. "Sniper's out of commission," Will said over the comms, his voice tinged with frustration. "But I'm alive. That's got to count for something." "Of course it does," Jill replied. "Hang tight. Recovery teams are on their way." Jill climbed back into her mech, her movements slow and deliberate as the weight of the battle settled over her. From the cockpit, she surveyed the ruins of the slums. Smoke curled into the sky, blotting out the distant spire's lights, which flickered faintly through the haze. Bodies of whistlers littered the ground, their bioluminescent blood glowing eerily in the shadows. The spire still stood, a testament to their resilience, but the cost of its survival was etched into the devastation surrounding it. The slums were barely habitable before, but now they were reduced to rubble. And for what? Jill couldn't shake the thought that the whistlers would return, stronger and more relentless than before. "This isn't sustainable," she muttered, her voice barely audible. The whistlers' adaptability and coordination were unlike anything humanity had faced. If every battle cost this much, how long could they hold the line? The recovery teams arrived, their transports descending like weary angels onto the battlefield. Medics swarmed around Max, stabilizing him and preparing him for evacuation. Will's mech was carefully hoisted onto a transport, its damaged railgun dangling like a broken limb. Jill returned in her cockpit, her mech standing vigil over the wreckage. The weight of command pressed heavily on her shoulders, but she couldn't falter. Not now. As the transport carrying Max lifted off, Jill keyed her comms. "We held the line today," she said, addressing both her remaining team and the evac crews. "Let's make sure it counts." She turned her gaze back to the spire one last time. Against the horizon, its silhouette stood tall amidst the smoke and ruin, a symbol of humanity's stubborn refusal to fall. Her mech's servos whined as she turned toward the evacuation point, her steps slow but deliberate. The battlefield grew smaller in her rear cameras, but the weight of the fight lingered in her chest. Victory came at a price, but it was a price they were willing to pay. And when the whistlers returned, Jill would be ready to face them again. As the sun set over the shattered city, the spire's lights flickered, defiantly piercing the encroaching darkness.
Black horizon.
Lieutenant Andrea Hale's hands hovered over the controls of her sleek scout fighter Novahawk, the quiet hum of its systems her only companion in the vast emptiness of high Earth orbit. Outside the narrow cockpit, the sprawling asteroid mining complex known as Perseus Station loomed in the distance, a skeletal ghost. The fighter's navigation HUD pinged faintly, marking the outer boundary of the cluster. Beyond lay an intricate web of interconnected asteroids, their surfaces scarred and hollowed by decades of mining. In their heyday, these asteroids had pulsed with activity. Now, they were cold, dead monuments to a waning frontier, their usefulness devoured and their purpose forgotten. Andrea shifted her gaze to the viewport as she eased the fighter closer. The first asteroid came into view, a massive rock suspended in the void, its surface pockmarked with mining rigs and blast craters. Thick steel cables stretched between it and the others, tethering them in a delicate lattice that swayed faintly in the microgravity. Some of the cables had snapped, their frayed ends drifting lazily in space like ghostly tendrils. As Novahawk glided through the outer reaches of Perseus Station, Hale scanned her surroundings. The once vibrant network of asteroids was now a crumbling, fragmented shell. Mining platforms hung crookedly off the rocks. Some collapsed entirely. Rotating transit rings meant to ferry workers and supplies spun aimlessly, no longer bound by human hands. Her sensors crackled faintly as she passed a cluster of debris, remnants of a solar-powered drone system. The station's original inhabitants had relied on an intricate network of automated machinery to handle resource extraction, but now, those machines hung lifeless, their circuitry fried by time and neglect. Hale toggled her comm system, opening a channel to her carrier fleet far beyond the edge of the cluster. Novahawk to Solace Command, entering Perseus Station perimeter. No immediate signs of activity. Beginning standard reconnaissance sweep. Her voice was calm, clipped, professional, an anchor in the unrelenting void. "Copy that, Hawk. Keep us posted," came the reply, crackling with interference. The distance between her and the fleet was vast, and the link would only grow weaker as she pushed deeper into the station's heart. She tapped a few keys, initiating the fighter's deep scan array. A faint hum vibrated through the hull as the ship's sensors began mapping the asteroid network. The data scrolled across her HUD, revealing the station's infrastructure. Narrow maintenance corridors threading between asteroids, long-defunct habitat modules, and storage bays with their airlocks left yawning open to space. Hale's thoughts drifted as the scan ran its course. She'd read the briefing on Perseus Station. Once the jewel of humanity's high-orbit mining operations, a critical node in the supply chain to Earth and the colonies. But as with so many projects, it had fallen victim to the unraveling. First came the failure of the Spire, Earth's orbital elevator, severing humanity's most efficient link between the surface and space. Then the wars tore apart Mars and its colonies. With no one left to maintain the outer installations, Perseus Station and its kin had been abandoned, the dream of a thriving space infrastructure left to rot. For Hale, it was more than a history lesson. It was personal. Her family had been among those who fled the chaos of Earth for an O'Neill cylinder. Life in space had been hard, isolated, and fragile. But it was the only life she knew, and now it felt as if the edges of that fragile existence were being picked apart, thread by thread. Her HUD pinged softly, jolting her from her reverie. Hale frowned as she reviewed the data feed. Faint power fluctuations. At first she thought it might be residual energy from the station's long-abandoned systems. But the patterns were irregular, pulsing in a way that suggested intent. A very complex pattern. "Odd," she murmured, leaning closer to the display. Novahawk's AI chirped in response, highlighting the source of the readings deep within the asteroid cluster. It was subtle, just a whisper of energy, like a heartbeat buried beneath layers of rock and steel. It shouldn't have been possible. Perseus Station had been abandoned for decades. The fighter drifted closer, its engines whispering against the void. Outside, the station seemed to darken, the light of distant stars swallowed by the looming asteroid shapes. Hale's gaze flicked to the solar panels again. A few of them were tilted, their surfaces charred and warped. At first she thought it might be damage from a micrometeorite storm, but the scorch marks radiated outward, as if something had burned through from within. Her pulse quickened. The power readings continued, steady now, leading her deeper into the station's labyrinth. This wasn't random. Someone, or something, had been here. The comm line crackled again, but this time it wasn't command. The static hissed and warbled, faint tones weaving through the interference like distorted whispers. Hale's throat tightened and she instinctively toggled the channel off. Her mind raced. The systemic failures that had plagued the mining operations, the fraying edges of humanity's reach into space, weren't just mechanical entropy or human negligence. There was something else. "Novahawk to Solace Command," she said, her voice firm but edged with tension, picking up anomalous energy signatures inside the cluster, requesting immediate analysis and advisement. No response. The comlink hissed, distorted and faint, before cutting to silence. Hale's grip tightened on the controls. As the fighter approached the heart of the cluster, a shadow began to emerge in the distance, massive and angular, a shape that didn't belong among the mining equipment. Hale squinted, her hands moving instinctively to the weapon's controls. In her gut, she knew she was about to confirm humanity's worst fears. Hale tightened her grip on the Novahawk's controls as the mining complex thinned out, the asteroids giving way to open void. Then she saw it. She couldn't help but hold her breath. It loomed ahead, a kilometer-long alien construct fused into the surface of a massive asteroid. It was like nothing she had seen before. The structure's surface was jagged and black, its angular design alien and insectoid in nature. Spindly limbs jutted from its sides like an insect's exoskeleton, each limb lined with sharp, spiked protrusions. The entire thing pulsed with an unnatural menace, as if the asteroid had been consumed and repurposed by some nightmarish intelligence. At one end of the structure, a glowing sphere of blue-green energy pulsed rhythmically, embedded like an organ in a twisted body. The light shimmered across the surface of the dock, casting eerie reflections on the asteroid's cold, rocky surface. Hale's sensors registered the energy signature as off the charts, her systems struggling to analyze the output. "Novahawk to Solace Command," Hale said, her voice clipped and deliberate. "I found something. It's not human." No response, only static. The calm silence was expected this deep into the cluster, but it didn't help her unease. This was wrong. The structure's design screamed predatory intent. It wasn't a derelict. It wasn't abandoned. It was alive. Hale deployed a trio of small sensor drones, her fingers working the controls with precision. The drones darted out, their metallic hulls glinting faintly as they zipped toward the alien structure. Each drone began its sweep, circling the dock in calculated orbits, scanning its jagged exterior for data. The readings were strange. Hale's HUD flickered as the scans returned information. Massive energy output, intricate internal structures, organic traces interwoven with the machinery. Hale frowned, adjusting the sensors. The drones were picking up faint signals from within the dock, signals that resembled a language or code. It wasn't anything she could decipher, but the rhythmic, almost melodic patterns unsettled her. It was as if the dock itself were singing to the void. Then, movement. The alien dock stirred. Spindly appendages along its surface unfurled like a flower blooming, revealing rows of angular shapes nestled within. The shapes moved, detaching from the dock and drifting into the void. Her heart sank as she realized what they were. Dozens of pyramid-shaped ships began to fan out, their lattice-like frameworks glinting faintly in the blue-green light of the energy sphere. Each one was a dark, alien creation, their sharp edges radiating hostility. Hale's jaw clenched as she spotted the grotesque addition at their fronts. Each ship was capped with a whistler-like head, its insectoid features molded into the alien vessels. The ships were spider-like in movement, their articulated legs adjusting mid-flight as they repositioned. They moved with precision, as if responding to some unseen signal. Her sensors blared a warning. The ships were scanning her back. Hale didn't waste time. Her fingers flew across the console as she initiated a priority alert to Solace Command. Nova Hawk to Solace Command, urgent report. Alien structure discovered in Perseus Station, approximate length 1 kilometer. Dozens of unknown fighters launching from the dock, transmitting visuals and data now. The console flickered. The data feed stuttered. No, come on. She glanced up, her breath catching in her throat. The alien fighters had noticed her. The lead vessel tilted slightly, its whistler-like head angling toward her. A faint glow built up along its frame, a sickly green hue that Hale instantly recognized as a weapon charge. Hale slammed her throttle forward, the Nova Hawk roaring to life as it banked hard to starboard. The first blast grazed the scout fighter's wing, a searing beam of green energy that sent sparks flying. She gritted her teeth as alarms screamed, her armor absorbing most of the blow. The alien fighters were fast, faster than anything she'd encountered before. They swarmed with terrifying efficiency, their angular forms darting through the asteroid field like predators closing in on prey. Hale fired her engines, weaving through the debris field to buy herself time. Behind her, the alien ships followed, their articulated legs shifting as they adjusted their trajectories mid-pursuit. Nova Hawk to Solace Command, I've been engaged. Repeat, I've been engaged by hostile forces. Static. Another blast streaked past her viewport, narrowly missing the cockpit. The alien weapons weren't just energy beams, they were accompanied by projectiles, small, squid-like drones launched in pursuit. Hale's HUD lit up with warnings as the drones latched onto debris, using the metal to slingshot closer. She banked hard, releasing a burst of chaff to confuse the incoming swarm. The drones scattered briefly, but they adjusted within seconds. Hale's hands moved instinctively, arming her missiles. If that's how you want to play. She fired, twin streaks of light arcing through the void. The missiles found their mark, slamming into one of the alien ships and detonating in a brilliant explosion. The lattice-like structure collapsed inward, the Whistler head disintegrating in the blast. The other fighters hesitated, as if recalculating. That's right, Hale muttered, her voice tight. I bite back. But even as she tried to steady herself, she couldn't shake the feeling growing in her gut. This wasn't a fight she could win. The Whistler-made dock was waking up, its energy sphere pulsing brighter with each passing moment. And there were more of them, more fighters, more drones, more danger than she could handle. Nova Hawk to Solace Command, she said, desperation creeping into her tone. The situation is worse than we thought. Way worse. She launched another missile, spinning the fighter into a tight barrel roll to avoid the retaliatory fire. Behind her, the alien fighters regrouped, their spider-like forms glinting with malevolent purpose as they continued their pursuit. Hale pushed the Nova Hawk to its limits, engines screaming as she dove deeper into the asteroid field. If she was going to survive, she needed more than skill. She needed a miracle. Hale's heart pounded in her chest as the Nova Hawk shuddered from the force of a near miss. Beams of sickly green energy lanced through space, slicing the darkness, leaving her no time to think, only react. The alien fighters were on her every moment. Let's see what you're made of, Hale muttered, her voice steady despite the chaos. Hale dove hard, banking sharply to avoid a salvo of coordinated fire that passed inches from her fuselage. The Nova Hawk's engine screamed as she darted between jagged fragments of mining infrastructure. Massive steel cables and broken solar arrays drifted like forgotten relics, offering momentary cover as energy beams scorched the debris around her. Hale flipped a switch, and the Novahawk's twin machine cannons roared to life. The heavy rounds streaked through the void, catching one of the alien fighters mid-turn. The lattice-like frame crumpled under the assault, and the ship exploded in a flash of blue-green light. "Gotcha," Hale hissed. Her brief triumph was cut short as the wreckage of the destroyed alien ship released several squid-like drones. The small, articulated creatures latched onto her fighter's hull, their metallic limbs clawing at the Novahawk's armor. Hale yanked the stick to throw the fighter into a violent spin. The Novahawk's engines howled as she dragged the ship dangerously close to a jagged fragment of mining scaffolding. Sparks erupted as the drones scraped against the structure, two of them shearing off entirely. The remaining drones clung stubbornly, their legs slicing deeper into the fighter's plating. Hale deployed a pulse of electromagnetic chaff, frying the remaining drones and sending them spiraling into the void. The battle escalated. More alien fighters swarmed into the fray. The Novahawk was already at its limits, weaving through the chaotic debris field with razor-sharp precision. A massive asteroid loomed ahead, its surface scarred by mining operations. Hale threaded her fighter through the narrow gaps in the mining infrastructure, using the drifting cables and machinery as cover. The alien ships pursued relentlessly, their lattice frames twisting unnaturally to fit through tight spaces. Energy beams cut through the void, illuminating the wreckage with ghostly green light. Hale's HUD lit up with proximity warnings as she deployed a cluster of autonomous combat drones. The small machines flitted out in all directions, drawing the alien fighters' attention. Two of the drones baited a group of pursuers into a cluster of machinery. Hale seized the opportunity, unleashing a barrage of machine cannon fire. The alien ships disintegrated in the resulting explosion, the shock wave rattling her cockpit. "Still breathing," she muttered, her hands steady on the controls, despite the sweat dripping down her forehead. Hale's sensors suddenly blared a new alert. The glowing sphere on the alien dock pulsed brighter, its light bathing the asteroid field in an eerie green-blue hue. Her scanners detected a massive energy buildup within the sphere, its readings spiking dangerously. "What is that thing?" she whispered. Before she could ponder further, a low-frequency signal emanated from the dock, a mechanical drone that seemed to echo across the void. Her sensors pinged new contacts. More alien fighters emerging from the shadowed recesses of the asteroid field. "Great," Hale muttered, punching the throttle. "Just what I needed." She set a course for the carrier, but the alien ships shifted, cutting off her escape route. They moved like a hive, anticipating her every move. She set a course for the carrier, but the alien ships shifted, cutting off her escape route. They moved like a school of fish, anticipating her every move. Hale's mind raced. Her ammunition was running low, and the Novahawk's armor wasn't designed to take a beating. She had to outthink them. Switching tactics, she deployed her remaining drones. This time she programmed them to mimic the Novahawk's signal, creating decoys that split off in different directions. Several alien ships peeled away to chase the false targets, buying her precious seconds. "Time to get reckless," she muttered, pushing the Novahawk into a dive that brought her perilously close to the alien dock. The spindly arms of the structure reached out like skeletal fingers, their jagged edges bristling with menace. Hale weaved through the dock's limbs, using its chaotic geometry to disrupt her pursuers. One alien fighter clipped an arm, the collision sending it spiraling into another ship. With a precise burst of her machine cannons, Hale targeted a critical joint in the dock's structure. The arm collapsed, smashing into two more alien fighters and sending debris cascading through the void. The remaining alien fighters regrouped, their whistler heads glowing brighter as they closed in for the kill. Hale's engines grumbled as she zigzagged through the debris field with desperate speed. Proximity alerts flared again. Another swarm of squid-like drones had launched from the dock, closing in fast. Hale gritted her teeth, launching a missile into a cluster of alien ships behind her. The explosion was blinding, scattering the drones and momentarily halting the pursuers. Hale didn't wait to see the outcome. She burned her engines at maximum thrust, the Nova Hawk streaking away from the chaos. Her cockpit was filled with the sound of alarms and the faint hum of damaged systems. She glanced back at the debris field, now glowing faintly with the light of the alien dock. "I hope they're listening," she muttered, her voice hoarse. "Because they have no idea what's coming." The Nova Hawk hurtled toward the carrier as fast as she dared. The Nova Hawk docked with the Eclipse Dawn, its battered frame barely holding together after the harrowing escape. Hale staggered out of the cockpit, her body aching from the fight's relentless strain. The carrier's hangar was dimly lit, its usual order and calm disrupted by the urgency of her arrival. Engineers swarmed her ship, their voices tense as they assessed the damage. "Respirai." "Hail Howl," a voice cut through the din. Commander Reyes stood at the edge of the hangar, his dark uniform as crisp as always. His sharp eyes betrayed a mixture of relief and apprehension. "Briefing room." "Now." Minutes later, Hale sat at the head of a conference table, her flight suit still marked with soot and sweat. The room was small, its walls lined with holographic displays flickering to life as she uploaded her data. Reyes and his senior officers leaned in, their faces illuminated by the cold glow of the alien dock's image. The footage was unsettling. The kilometer-long spiked structure rotated slowly, its glowing sphere pulsing like a malignant heart. Alien fighters swarmed around it, their movements coordinated and unnatural. The room was silent as the data played out, punctuated only by the occasional hiss of air vents. "This isn't just an anomaly," Reyes finally said, his voice low and steady. "It's a beachhead." Hale nodded, her throat dry. "The Whistlers aren't scavengers anymore. They've built something. And it's massive." Reyes turned to his officers. "We're looking at the next stage of this war. We need to get this to high command." Before they could continue, a klaxon blared through the ship. The room's lights dimmed, replaced by a red emergency glow. The voice of the tactical officer came through the intercom. "Commander, sensors are picking up multiple contacts emerging from the asteroid field. It's a swarm, sir." The Eclipse Dawn's bridge buzzed with activity as Reyes and Hale entered. Holographic displays lit up with the movement of hundreds of alien contacts pouring out from the asteroid mining complex. The glowing sphere on the dock pulsed faster now, its light cascading across the void like a harbinger of doom. Hale froze, her eyes locked on the screen. "It's calling them." The swarm emerged like a tide, black, lattice-like ships with glowing whistler heads moving with eerie synchronicity, like a school of fish. They surrounded the human fleet like a predator encircling its prey. "Red alert," Reyes barked. "All hands to battle stations, prepare to engage." The carrier's guns roared to life as the swarm closed in. Railgun rounds streaked across the void, tearing into the first wave of alien fighters. Explosions lit up the darkness, but the Whistler ships pressed forward, their energy weapons slicing through space. The Eclipse Dawn rocked violently as an energy beam struck its port side. Sparks erupted from control panels and the acrid smell of burnt circuitry filled the air. The tactical officer shouted, "They're overwhelming our defenses." Hale's stomach churned as she watched the swarm maneuver. Each destruction of one fighter only seemed to summon more, like cutting through an unending tide. The human fleet fought valiantly, but it was clear they were outmatched. The larger ships, burdened with slower weapons, became easy targets. A nearby destroyer erupted into a fireball, its fragments scattering into the void. Reyes gripped the edge of the command console, his voice calm despite the chaos. "Signal the fleet. Begin evacuation procedures. We're pulling out." Hale's hands clenched into fists. "We're running?" "We're surviving, Lieutenant," Reyes snapped. "If we stay, we're all dead." As the order was relayed, the human ships began to fall back. The Eclipse Dawn's engines roared, propelling it away from the battlefield. Smaller escort ships formed a protective screen, their guns buying precious seconds for the carrier to escape. But the Whistlers gave chase. Their ships moved with terrifying speed, their energy weapons carving through human vessels like paper. Hale watched in horror as a frigate was torn apart, its crew's final moments marked by a silent, fiery explosion. In a desperate maneuver, the Eclipse Dawn deployed flares and decoys, scattering the swarm's formation. For a brief moment, the carrier slipped into the shadows of a drifting asteroid, its engines burning hard to put distance between itself and the pursuing swarm. The Eclipse Dawn limped away, its hull scarred and its system strained. Inside, the atmosphere was heavy with the weight of loss. The fleet had suffered catastrophic damage, especially for such a brief encounter. Entire crews lost, ships reduced to debris. The remnants of humanity's presence in high Earth orbit were now little more than scattered wreckage. In the quiet of the debriefing room, Hale sat alone, replaying the footage from her fighter. The glowing sphere on the alien dock continued to pulse, its light spreading across the asteroid field like a dark omen. More Whistler ships poured out of the structure, their numbers swelling as they prepared to expand beyond the asteroid cluster. Reyes placed a hand on Hale's shoulder. "You did your job, Lieutenant. You gave us a chance to fight another day." Hale shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "We can't fight this. Not like this. They are endless." The commander sighed, his gaze fixed on the holographic projection of the alien dock. "Then we'll find another way. We always do." Hale didn't reply. Her eyes lingered on the projection. The glowing sphere now burned into her mind. As the Eclipse Dawn drifted away from the battlefield, the final image from the external cameras showed the alien dock flickering. In the void, barely visible at this distance, its pulsing sphere cast an otherworldly glow, and the Whistler swarm spread outward like a plague, inching closer to humanity's fragile, shrinking frontier. In her quarters, Hale stared out of the viewport at the distant stars. Earth was a faint blue dot against the black of space. They had their own Whistler problems down there. Humanity couldn't take a war on two fronts like this. The bugs weren't just a threat, they were a reckoning, and humanity was running out of time.
Falling Star.
The ruins of the outer city stretched out in a jagged maze of crumbling concrete and rusted steel. Shadows clung to the ruins like old scars, concealing dangers both known and unknown. Cade led the trio, his power armor humming softly with every step, its servos adjusting to the uneven terrain. The faint blue glow of his HUD reflected on his hardened face as he scanned the rubble for movement. He raised a gauntleted hand, signaling a halt. "Be careful," he muttered, his voice gravelly over the comms. "This area's got scavenger traffic written all over it." Behind him, Jansen adjusted his heavy rifle, his armored figure casting a long shadow over the rubble. "Let them try," he said evenly, his tone carrying the quiet confidence of a seasoned soldier. Dr. Martell brought up the rear, her powered exoskeleton hissing with every step. The suit wasn't as seamless as the power armor Cade and Jansen wore. It lacked the fluidity of years-tested engineering. She winced as the hard frame pressed against a fresh bruise on her ribcage, a souvenir from her last training session. "Remind me again," Martell said, her voice strained but determined. "Why couldn't I just analyze this ship remotely?" Cade didn't look back. "Because the last time we left something valuable out here, it ended up in Medina's hands. You're here to make sure that doesn't happen again." Martell sighed, gripping the analysis tools strapped to her chest rig. She wasn't a soldier, and the exoskeleton felt more like a cage than an advantage. But she'd trained for this. Long days in the sim-pods, hours fighting Cade and Jansen, bruises notwithstanding, and she wasn't about to let them see her struggle. The group moved in silence for the next few blocks, their footsteps crunching softly against broken asphalt. The ruined city rose around them like jagged teeth, skyscrapers stripped to their steel skeletons. Faint graffiti on the walls warned scavengers to keep out, marked with symbols that belonged to Medina's gang. Cade stopped abruptly, raising a fist. His HUD blinked with an alert. "Drone intel was right. We're not alone out here," he said. Jansen raised his rifle, scanning the debris-strewn road ahead. "Scavengers?" "Not yet," Cade replied, "but I don't trust a city this quiet." Martel's heart thudded in her chest as she adjusted the harness inside her exoskeleton. "How far is the site?" she asked. "Another 5 blocks," Cade said. "Stay close. We keep moving." The trio advanced cautiously, their route weaving between collapsed buildings and derelict vehicles. The air was heavy with the metallic tang of rust and the faint stench of stagnant water. Martel's suit HUD chimed softly, feeding her telemetry data on the area's atmospheric conditions. She glanced nervously at the ruined skyline, imagining what kind of scavengers might already be on their trail. As they neared the target site, a faint, rhythmic sound reached them. A low, melodic hum carried on the wind. It wasn't mechanical, nor did it seem natural. It prickled the edges of Martel's senses. And she wasn't alone. "You hear that?" Jansen asked, his voice low. "Yeah," Cade replied, scanning the area. "Could be wind through the ruins, or something worse." Martel's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the controls on her exosuit. The tension was palpable, the sense of unseen eyes watching from the shadows. "Eyes up, weapons ready," Cade ordered. "Whatever it is, we'll deal with it. We just need to get to that ship." The faint hum grew louder as they approached the crash site. The team passed a crumbling archway that led into a sunken section of the city. The frigate lay embedded into the remains of a shattered building, its hull jagged and weathered by years of exposure. "There," Cade said, pointing toward the ship. It was a small, sleek, pre-war craft, partially hidden beneath the rubble. The design was unmistakably military, its once pristine plating now scorched and pitted. Time had claimed most of its exterior, leaving it nearly indistinguishable from the ruins around it. "You'd have to know it was here to even find it," Jansen said, lowering his weapon slightly. Cade nodded. "Exactly why we're here. Let's move. Martel, get ready to analyze that black box." As the trio approached the ship, the melodic hum faded, replaced by an uneasy silence. Martel felt her skin prickle, her instincts screaming that something wasn't right. "Kay," she began, her voice shaky. "I know," he said. A jagged breach near its midsection provided an improvised entry point. The metal peeled back, like the skin of a wounded beast. "Looks like our way in," Cade said, gesturing toward the breach. Jansen nodded, stepping ahead to secure the perimeter. "No signs of scavengers. Either we got lucky or they're already inside." Martel hesitated, staring at the ship. Even with the exoskeleton amplifying her strength, she felt small and vulnerable next to its looming presence. "This thing looks ancient," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because it is," Cade replied. "Let's move. Clock's ticking." The trio entered the ship, their boots crunching against shattered glass and twisted debris. The corridors were dark and eerily silent, the air thick with the scent of scorched metal and something faintly sweet, like decaying fruit. Cade's helmet lamp illuminated the warped interior, the walls streaked with scorch marks and jagged gashes. "Careful," Cade warned. "This place is a tomb. Don't touch anything unless you have to." Martel trailed behind, her exoskeleton making her movements clunky and loud in the confined space. She winced as the frame pressed against her bruised ribs, but she kept moving, clutching the data retrieval unit tightly. The tilted corridors made navigation treacherous. Every surface was at an angle, forcing them to climb over debris or brace themselves against the walls to keep their balance. "Is that writing?" Martel asked, pausing to examine the markings. "Looks like it," Jansen said, his tone grim. "Doesn't mean anything good. Probably gang stuff." Kay turned back to her. "Keep moving. We're not here to sightsee." As they advanced deeper into the ship, the trio split their focus. Cade and Jansen scanned every shadow, their weapons at the ready, while Martel set up her equipment near what appeared to be the ship's central command console. Martel went to work, struggling to connect her equipment to the console. The interface was old, almost alien, its controls unintuitive and unresponsive. Her exoskeleton didn't make things easier, the bulky frame making precise movements a chore. Come on, she hissed, sweat dripping down her temple as she worked. You good back there? Cade asked, glancing over his shoulder. I'm fine, she snapped, more out of frustration than anger. Just give me a minute. Jansen chuckled softly. Take your time, Doc. Not like we're standing in the middle of a scavenger hotspot or anything. Martel ignored him, focusing on the task at hand. The black box's encrypted data began to trickle through her equipment, but the process was agonizingly slow. I'm getting something, she said finally. This thing has been here a long time. The logs are corrupted, but I think... She froze as a new set of alerts flashed across her screen. Wait. The nuclear drive. It's not here. What do you mean, not here? Cade demanded, stepping closer. Martel pointed to the console. The ship's systems show it was ripped out. See these readings? There's coolant leakage and radiation traces, but the drive itself is gone. Johnson swore under his breath. Scavengers? Martel shook her head, her expression grim. No. Look at this. She gestured to the floor near the console. Claw-like marks gouged deep into the metal, their precision unnatural and deliberate. Whistlers, Cade said, his voice low. Jansen's grip on his rifle tightened. That explains the tunnel. Martel followed his gaze. At the far end of the chamber, the floor gave way to a gaping hole, its edges jagged and uneven. The tunnel stretched downward, disappearing into the darkness below. This wasn't in the drone's report, Cade said, his tone sharp. Maybe it's recent, Martel replied, her voice shaking slightly. The trio stood in tense silence, the air thick with the realization of what they'd stumbled into. Pack it up, Cade ordered. We're leaving. Now. Martel scrambled to disconnect her equipment as Jansen and Cade kept their weapons trained on the tunnel. Cade and Jansen kept watch nearby, their armored forms blending into the twisted metal of the ship's dim interior. Then the sound came, a faint shuffle, the crunch of debris underfoot. Cade raised a fist, signaling silence. Jansen's visor glinted as he scanned the corridor with his weapon raised. Martel froze, her fingers hovering over the controls. The faint, hushed voices of multiple people echoed down the hall. And then came the unmistakable sound of a rifle being cocked. Cade muttered into the comm, "We're not alone." A group of figures emerged from the shadows, their faces half hidden beneath makeshift masks. The Medina gang. They moved with unnatural confidence, their glowing veins pulsing faintly beneath their skin, a sure sign of luster coursing through their systems. Their leader, a wiry man with a jagged scar down his cheek, stepped forward, his shotgun trained on Cade. Well, well, the man sneered. Looks like we've got ourselves some corporate dogs sniffing where they don't belong. We're not looking for trouble, Cade replied coolly, his hand tightening on his rifle. Turn around and walk away. The gang leader's grin widened, feral and unnerving. See, that's the thing. You've already found trouble. Now hand over whatever tech you've got, or we'll take it off your corpses. Jansen let out a low growl. Your call, Cade. Open fire, Cade ordered, his tone cold as ice. The Medina gang opened fire, their weapons blazing in the narrow confines of the wreck. Jansen stepped forward, his heavy weapon roaring to life. The sheer force of his burst turned the corridor into a kill zone, scattering debris and forcing the scavengers to take cover. Sparks flew as bullets ricocheted off the metal walls, and the air grew thick with smoke. Keep them bottled up, Cade barked, moving to flank the scavengers. His power armor moved with fluid precision, the servos humming softly as he darted through the maze-like corridors. He launched a grenade down an adjacent passage, the explosion rocking the ship and sending several gang members sprawling. Meanwhile, Martel ducked behind a console, clutching a compact pistol in trembling hands. Her exoskeleton's enhanced strength made her a formidable presence, but she was no soldier. She peeked around the edge of her cover, her breath hitching as one of the gang members broke through Jansen's suppressive fire and charged her position. The man's eyes were wild, his movements erratic but unnervingly fast. Martel fired, the shot grazing his shoulder, but he didn't stop. With a guttural yell, he lunged at her. Martel screamed, raising her arms just in time to catch him. The exoskeleton servos whined as she pushed back, slamming him against the wall. The impact stunned him long enough for her to grab a nearby piece of debris and bash him across the head, sending him crumpling to the floor. "Martel, you good?" Jansen's voice crackled in her comm. "Barely," she gasped, her voice shaky but determined. "Keep them off me." Jansen held the corridor, his bursts controlled and accurate. The gang was relentless, their movements erratic yet coordinated, their aggression amplified by the luster. Even as Jansen mowed down one after another, more kept coming. Cade, meanwhile, moved like a shadow through the wreckage. He caught the gang leader off guard, grabbing him from behind and slamming him into the wall. The shotgun clattered to the ground, and Cade wasted no time, delivering a sharp blow to the man's temple with his armored fist. The leader crumpled, unconscious. The gang's reinforcements were already flooding the ship. Cade's HUD flagged multiple heat signatures converging on their location, and the distant shouts of more scavengers confirmed the grim reality. They were outnumbered. "Time to go," Cade ordered, grabbing the unconscious gang leader's shotgun for good measure. He motioned for Martel to fall back. Johnson's weapon overheated with a loud whine, forcing him to switch to his sidearm as he fell back toward the group. "We're not going to hold them much longer, Cade." The gang pushed forward, their manic energy driving them to near-suicidal bravery. Cade pulled a remote detonator from his belt and tossed a small charge onto a weakened support beam. "Get clear," he shouted. The charge detonated, collapsing a section of the corridor and cutting off the majority of the gang. The wreck groaned in protest, the walls trembling as debris rained down. The team used the chaos to retreat, emerging into the ruins outside. But the gang wasn't giving up. Shouts and footsteps echoed behind them as scavengers poured out of the wreck, their glowing veins visible even in the dim light. "We need to move," Martel yelled, her exoskeleton whirring as she struggled to keep up with the others. Cade fired over his shoulder as they sprinted through the ruins. The gang was relentless, their pursuit as much a testament to their desperation as to the madness induced by luster. The trio finally reached a narrow passageway, too tight for the gang's numbers to follow easily. Cade tossed another charge, collapsing the entrance behind them and sealing off their pursuers. Breathing hard, the team paused to regroup, their armor battered and their nerves frayed. "Is it always like this?" Martel asked, her voice shaky as she leaned against a wall. Cade glanced at her, his expression unreadable behind his visor. "You'll get used to it." Jansen chuckled darkly, reloading his weapon. "Welcome to the spine, Doc." The air in the tunnel was thick with the acrid stench of spent ammunition and scorched metal. The trio moved slowly, their footsteps splashing in shallow puddles left from the earlier flooding. Martel's exoskeleton hissed with each strained movement, its servos groaning under the weight of her fatigue. Cade led the group, his power armor dented, the edges of his blade still slick with scavenger blood. Jansen followed close behind, his rifle held low, its barrel blackened from overuse. "Medina's people won't be coming back any time soon," Jansen muttered, his voice a mixture of relief and exhaustion. "Not after the beating we just gave them." Cade didn't reply. His eyes scanned every shadow, his instincts still razor-sharp despite the battle's end. The eerie glow of luster still lingered in his mind, the manic intensity of their enemies, unnerving even for someone as hardened as him. Martel trailed behind, clutching the black box tightly against her chest. Her hands trembled, not from exhaustion, but from the weight of the data it contained. The truth was close, she could feel it, and it scared her more than the scavengers ever could. The trio finally reached a small maintenance alcove, a brief respite from the tension of the ruins. Martel dropped to her knees, her exoskeleton locking in place to support her weight. She plugged the black box into her portable analyzer, her fingers fumbling with the cables. "Make it quick, Doc," Cade urged, his voice low and urgent. "We're not out of danger yet." The device hummed to life, its screen flashing as it decrypted the black box's data. Lines of corrupted code scrolled past before resolving into coherent logs. Martel's eyes widened as she read through the records. "This ship," she began, her voice faltering, "it didn't crash because of an accident or the war. It was targeted." "Targeted by what?" Jansen asked, stepping closer, his helmet light illuminating her pale face. Martel swallowed hard. "The Whistlers. They brought it down. The ship's drive logs show erratic energy readings before the crash, consistent with Whistler activity. They tunneled into the ship, breached its systems, and disconnected the nuclear drive." The room fell silent, the weight of her words sinking in. Cade crossed his arms, his face grim. "That ship's been here for over 2 decades. You're telling me those things have been in the spine all this time, hiding right under our feet?" Martel nodded, her voice trembling. "They're not just scavengers or insects. They're deliberate, coordinated. They knew exactly what they were doing." The realization hit them like a physical blow. The nuclear drive wasn't just a random theft. It was part of something bigger, something the trio couldn't yet comprehend. "They've been feeding off the city's infrastructure," Martel continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "The energy, the coolant systems, it's all connected. This isn't just survival, it's strategy." Jansen exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "You're saying they're planning something? What, to take over the spine? The whole planet?" "I don't know," Martel admitted, her hands gripping the analyzer tightly. "But if they've had 20 years to prepare, we might already be too late." Kate stepped forward, placing a hand on her shoulder. His voice was steady, reassuring despite the grim news. "We're not too late. Not yet. We've got this data. We know they're here. That's more than anyone else has had in 20 years. The trio gathered their gear, their minds heavy with the implications of their discovery. They had completed their mission, but it felt like only the beginning of something far more dangerous. "Let's move," Cade said, his voice cutting through the tension. "We need to get back to base and report this. That tunnel," he gestured to the dark opening they had left behind, "it's going to need a full team to investigate." As they limped back through the ruins, the city's eerie silence seemed louder than ever. The glow of their armor lights cast long, distorted shadows on the broken walls, a haunting reminder of what they had faced. Martel clutched the black box tightly, her thoughts racing. The data was damning, a ticking time bomb of truth that could change everything. The Whistlers weren't just a threat. They were an enemy, patient and methodical, biding their time. The trio finally reached their staging area, their armor battered, their bodies bruised, but their resolve unbroken. As they awaited extraction, Martel stared at the horizon, where the remnants of the spine loomed against the night sky. "We're not ready for this," she murmured. Cade overheard her, his expression unreadable beneath his helmet. "We'll have to be." Pipe cleaners. The staging area buzzed with the low hum of power armor servos and the occasional crackle of static over comms. The underground maintenance facility near the spine's magnetic catapult was a stark contrast to the gleaming towers of the city above. A realm of rust, frost-covered pipes, and shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly. Here, beneath the colossal structure responsible for keeping the orbital stations alive, the air was thick with the weight of necessity. The catapult had to be repaired, no matter the cost. Donovan stood at the center of his squad, his helmet tucked under one arm. The harsh overhead lights flickered intermittently, casting jagged shadows across his power armor. Scuffed and worn from countless battles, the matte black plates bore the marks of a soldier who had seen it all. His voice was steady, calm, but carried an edge that demanded attention. "Listen up," Donovan began, his sharp eyes scanning the 3 soldiers standing before him. "This isn't just another sweep and clear. That catapult is the lifeline for space. Without it, every station and colony relying on those supplies is as good as dead. The squad members nodded, their expressions a mixture of grim determination and readiness. Collins, the demolitions expert, leaned casually against a crate, his gear bristling with explosives. His smirk was faint, but his eyes betrayed his focus. "Explosions don't fix coolant leaks, boss," he quipped, his tone light but his grip on a satchel charge firm. "They do when the leaks bite back," Donovan shot back without missing a beat. "Stay sharp." Next to Collins, Vargas adjusted her helmet optics. The sniper was quiet as always, her demeanor as precise as the enhanced lenses on her armor. "What's the word on the drone?" she asked, her voice calm but tinged with curiosity. "Gone," Donovan replied bluntly. "We lost contact 5 minutes after deployment. Last footage showed severed pipes and—" He paused, his jaw tightening. A sound, rhythmic, like a whistle. The room fell silent. The faint hum of the facility's aging power grid filled the void. Keller, the heavy weapons specialist, shifted uneasily. His reinforced armor made him a towering figure, and the massive cannon slung over his shoulder only added to the impression. "Whistlers," he muttered, his voice low. "Gotta be." Donovan didn't confirm or deny. Instead, he turned toward the holographic map flickering above a battered console. The layout of the tunnels spread out before them like the veins of some colossal beast, twisting, intersecting, and spiraling into the depths. "The coolant system's main hub is here," Donovan said, pointing to a central chamber marked in red. "Engineers need it secured before they can even think about starting repairs. The power drain is coming from this sector." He indicated an adjacent area marked in yellow. "If there's a nest, it's likely here. That's where we'll start." Collins whistled softly. "Lot of ground to cover for 4 people." "We've done more with less," Donovan replied. "And I'm not expecting a welcoming committee. Budget cuts mean this place hasn't seen maintenance crews in years. It's flooded in parts, drained in others. Expect frost, rust, and unstable ground." Vargas leaned in, her sharp gaze fixed on the map. "What about the engineers who were here before?" Donovan's face darkened. "Only one made it back. Couldn't make repairs. He actually flooded part of the area, but that's mostly drained now, which is why we're going in first." The tension in the room thickened. Collins shifted, cracking his knuckles. "So, we clear out the boogeymen and get home in time for dinner. Simple enough?" "It's never simple," Keller grunted. "Not down here." As if on cue, the lights flickered again, casting the room in brief darkness. When they stabilized, Donovan stepped back from the console and slipped on his helmet. The HUD lit up with tactical overlays and mission objectives. "Collins, you're on demolition. Clear any blockages and secure our fallback routes. Vargas, your eyes on from a distance. Keller, your point for close quarters. Everyone stays together, no lone wolves." "And if we hear whistling?" Collins asked, his smirk fading. "Then we move fast," Donovan replied, his voice steel. "And we shoot faster." The squad fell into formation as Donovan led the way toward the tunnel entrance. The metal doors groaned as they slid open, revealing the yawning blackness beyond. A chill gust of air carried the faint smell of coolant and decay, setting nerves on edge. "All right," Donovan said, his tone firm. "Let's clean this place up." The squad advanced into the darkness, the rhythmic clank of their armor echoing through the tunnel. Somewhere in the depths, a faint sound drifted back toward them. A whistle, faint but deliberate. Donovan's jaw clenched, his rifle rising as he led his team deeper into the spine's cold, unwelcoming underbelly. The hunt had begun. The tunnel stretched ahead like the gullet of some massive industrial beast. The squad's footsteps echoed in measured beats, punctuated by the occasional hiss of steam escaping from fractured pipes. Donovan led the way, his rifle at the ready, its barrel casting faint reflections from the bioluminescent puddles scattered across the floor. The glow wasn't natural, nothing here was. It came from coolant spills, glimmering faintly, as if warning the intruders of dangers ahead. "Eyes sharp," Donovan muttered into the calm. His voice carried the weight of experience, a reminder to his team that vigilance wasn't optional down here. Collins broke the silence, his tone light but strained. You ever feel like these places are alive, all the hissing and creaking, like it's breathing? Cut the chatter, Vargas said, her voice clipped as her enhanced optics swept the passage ahead. Something's not right. The tunnel groaned ominously, as if agreeing with her. Above, corroded pipes leaked thin streams of coolant that sizzled as they hit the floor. The air was damp and heavy, carrying the metallic tang of rust and the faint, acrid bite of burned circuitry. The squad came to a halt at a junction where rusted safety rails lined a grated platform. Vargas held up a hand, signaling a stop, her sniper rifle scanning the area. Although it was almost claustrophobic, the tunnels went a long way. "What is it?" Donovan asked. She pointed to a severed safety line dangling from about 50 yards away. It swayed slightly in the faint draft, its end cut clean. "This must be where the first team came down," Vargas said grimly. "Didn't end well." "Looks like we still have a long way down to go," Keller added, his voice a low rumble. He gestured to scrape marks leading from the grating into a side corridor. Donovan's jaw tightened. He motioned for the squad to move forward. As they advanced, Collins paused to examine a section of wall. Deep gouges marred the surface, cutting through layers of grime to reveal raw, gleaming metal beneath. "Claw marks," he said, running a gloved finger along the grooves. "Big ones." "Whistlers," Keller muttered, gripping his heavy rifle tighter. "They've been here a while." The air grew colder as the squad pressed on, the faint sound of dripping water joining the orchestra of groaning metal. The light ahead flickered erratically, revealing a shadow that moved in unnatural jerks. "There," Vargas whispered, her voice taut. She raised her rifle and the squad froze. A whistler crouched by a leaking coolant pipe, its glossy black exoskeleton shimmering faintly in the dim light. It was larger than the ones Donovan had seen before, but something was off. Its movements were sluggish, its limbs trembling as if the creature were struggling against its own weight. Donovan raised a fist to signal a halt, but the whistler's head snapped up, its triangular face tilting toward them. The faint whistling began, melodic and unsettling, reverberating through the tunnel like a dirge. "Take it down," Donovan ordered, his voice low and firm. Keller stepped forward, his rifle unleashing a burst of heavy fire. The rounds struck the whistler, cracking its exoskeleton and sending a spray of glowing fluid across the walls. But the creature burst into action. It darted sideways, its talons scraping against the floor as it lunged for Keller. "Move!" Donovan barked. Keller swung the butt of his rifle, catching the creature in its side. It staggered, its whistling turning sharp and discordant, a sound that made the hairs on the back of Donovan's neck stand on end. Vargas fired next, a precision shot that pierced the creature's leg, finally sending it collapsing into a heap of twitching limbs. Keller finished it off with another long burst. The squad stood over the corpse, their breath visible in the frigid air. Glowing fluid pooled beneath the whistler, casting an eerie light that danced across their armor. "That was slower than usual," Keller said, his voice gruff. "They're usually on you before you can blink." "It's the coolant," Donovan said, crouching to examine the creature. "They're feeding on it, but it's affecting them. Maybe it's not enough, or maybe it's too much." "That whistle, though," Collins added, glancing nervously down the tunnel. "It wasn't just noise." Donovan straightened, his eyes narrowing. The faint whistle that had accompanied the whistler hadn't faded. It had grown distant, echoing through the tunnels like a ripple in a dark lake. "They know we're here," he said, his voice grim. "And they're calling for backup." Without waiting for questions, he motioned for the squad to move. "Double time. We've stirred the nest. Let's not be here when it wakes up." As the squad moved deeper into the maze, the oppressive silence of the tunnels was replaced by the faint, rhythmic melody of distant whistling. It was everywhere and nowhere, all at once, a ghostly warning that this mission had only just begun. The squad moved cautiously through the labyrinth of tunnels, their footsteps muffled by the damp grime coating the floor. When they entered the coolant chamber, the sheer size of it brought them to a collective halt. The room was cavernous, an industrial cathedral dominated by colossal coolant pipes and hulking machinery. The faint bioluminescent glow of spilled coolant cast everything in an unnatural green boule hue, dancing across the jagged walls and shadowy recesses. The air hummed faintly with static electricity, making the hair on Donovan's arms stand on end even beneath the insulation of his power armor. "Whoa," Collins muttered, taking in the alien beauty of the scene. "Looks like something out of a bad dream." Donovan ignored him, his eyes locked on the center of the chamber. There, nestled between the coolant systems and humming machinery, was a sprawling, nest-like structure. It was a grotesque amalgamation of scavenged metal, torn cables, and organic material that glistened in the dim light. Bioluminescent liquid trickled down its sides, pooling around the base in a fluorescent lake. Around the nest, several whistlers moved sluggishly, their glossy exoskeletons reflecting the eerie glow. Their triangular heads tilted erratically, and their scalpel-edged limbs twitched, as if struggling to maintain control. "Contact," Vargas whispered through the comms, her rifle already trained on one of the creatures. "Looks like they've set up shop." Donovan scanned the scene, his HUD tagging each whistler as a hostile. "They're feeding," he muttered. "That coolant, it's messing with them." "Messing with them or powering them," Keller grunted, his heavy weapon ready. "Doesn't matter. They're not staying." Donovan's sharp eyes assessed the room, noting the whistlers' erratic movements. Though slower than usual, they still exuded an unsettling sense of menace. Their heads snapped to attention at the faintest sound, and the rhythmic whistling filled the chamber like a haunting melody. It was as if the very walls were singing a dirge for the squad. "Spread out," Donovan ordered. "Take cover, stay quiet. Collins, get those shock charges in place. We funnel them, box them in." Collins nodded, moving with practiced efficiency along the edge of the chamber. He planted the charges at key access points, each one emitting a faint electronic beep as it armed. Vargas crouched behind a coolant pipe, her enhanced optics scanning the nest, while Keller took up position near a massive conduit, his heavy weapon humming faintly as it primed. The whistlers hadn't noticed them yet, but the tension in the air was palpable. Every creak of metal, every hiss of coolant made the squad flinch. Donovan's grip on his rifle tightened. They were in the belly of the beast now, and it was only a matter of time before it woke. "Charges set," Collins whispered. "Ready when you are, boss." Donovan took a deep breath. "On my mark. Vargas, pick off the far one. Keller, light 'em up when they move. Collins, trigger the charges after the first volley." The squad acknowledged in unison, their voices tight with adrenaline. Donovan's finger hovered over his trigger. "Mark!" The room erupted in chaos. Vargas's rifle barked first, the shot piercing the skull of a whistler near the coolant pool. The creature collapsed with a wet thud, its glowing blood spraying across the floor. The others reacted instantly, their heads snapping toward the squad's position. The melodic whistling transformed into a sharp, discordant wail that reverberated through the chamber. Keller opened fire, his heavy rifle roaring as a hail of bullets tore into the nest. Metal shards and organic debris exploded outward, and 2 whistlers were shredded in the initial barrage. Collins triggered the charges, and a series of sharp explosions funneled the remaining whistlers toward the squad's kill zone. But the creatures didn't panic. Even in their lethargic state, their movements were calculated and predatory. One darted sideways, using the nest as cover, while another scaled the coolant pipes with eerie grace, its claws cutting into the metal as it climbed. "They're spreading too wide," Vargas called out, firing at the climber. Her shots connected, but the creature pressed on, its glowing blood dripping onto the machinery below. A whistler lunged at Keller, but he swung his weapon like a club, catching the creature mid-leap and sending it crashing into a wall. Before he could finish it off, another emerged from the shadows, forcing him to retreat under a hail of sparks and coolant spray. Donovan's rifle barked as he advanced, his shots ripping through another whistler's torso. The creature crumpled, its whistling dying with a wet gurgle. But the squad was losing their initial advantage. The creatures were no longer sluggish. The coolant that had dulled them seemed to wear off as the heat of battle intensified. "Keep them off balance," Donovan barked. "Collins, cover Keller. Vargas, take out that climber." Collins moved quickly, his grenades sending shock waves through the chamber. The explosions disoriented the whistlers, but it was only temporary. One creature leapt through the smoke, its claws grazing Collins's armor. He stumbled but recovered, firing his sidearm into its head at point-blank range before switching to his rifle to finish it off. Vargas finally landed a clean shot on the climber, the impact sending it plummeting into the bioluminescent pool below. It writhed briefly before going still, its glowing blood spreading like an oil slick. By the time the last whistler fell, the chamber was a war zone. The nest was in ruins, and the floor was slick with glowing blood and coolant. Keller leaned against a shattered pipe, his armor dented and scorched. Vargas's rifle smoked faintly as she scanned the room, her breathing ragged. Collins wiped his visor, muttering, "Remind me to ask for a raise." Donovan stood in the center of the carnage, his rifle still aimed at the nest. The melodic whistling had faded, replaced by the hum of damaged machinery and the hiss of leaking coolant. He lowered his weapon slowly, his eyes sweeping the chamber one last time. "Clear," he said finally, though his voice lacked conviction. "Let's secure the rest of this area. This place needs more repairs, and a mop." As the squad regrouped, the faint echo of the whistler's melody seemed to linger, a reminder that the battle was won, but the war was far from over. The tunnels echoed with chaos. Gunfire, screams, and the eerie melodic whistling of the whistlers reverberated through the labyrinthine passages. The squad had regrouped near a cluster of coolant conduits, their weapons at the ready. The confined space worked against them. The whistlers, with their unnatural grace, darted through vents, pipes, and shadowy alcoves. Keller braced himself against a coolant pipe, his heavy rifle trained on a vent. The sound of claws scraping metal reached his ears a split second before a whistler burst through a grate. Its jagged limbs slashed at him, cutting through his shoulder plate. He roared in pain, falling back as the creature prepared to lunge again. "Got it!" Vargas shouted. Her rifle went off, and the whistler's head snapped back, its glowing blood spraying across the walls as it collapsed. Donovan moved swiftly, his HUD flashing warnings of multiple hostiles. "Stay tight! Watch the vents!" he shouted, his voice sharp but steady. Another whistler lunged from a side passage, aiming for Collins. Donovan intercepted it mid-air, his reinforced gauntlets slamming into its carapace, sending it crashing into a wall. But there was no time to celebrate. The whistlers moved as one, their haunting sounds harmonizing into a chorus of coordinated destruction. "Collins, we need a choke point." "Funnel them," Donovan shouted over the cacophony. "On it." Collins sprinted to a nearby junction, planting explosive charges along the narrow passage. "Fall back. Let's see how they like this." The squad retreated just as the first whistler swarmed the junction. Collins triggered the detonator and the explosion rocked the tunnels, shrapnel tearing through the creatures. Keller, bleeding but determined, took point with his heavy weapon. "Come on, you freaks," he bellowed, unleashing a barrage of fire. The rounds tore through two whistlers, their bioluminescent blood splattering across the ceiling like an unholy rain. Vargas picked off another from a distance, her enhanced optics allowing her to see through the swirling mist of coolant and smoke. "3 more on your left, Donovan," she called out. Donovan turned just in time to face the oncoming trio. His rifle barked, dropping one, but the remaining 2 closed the distance. He shifted to his power armor's blade, a reinforced steel edge designed for close-quarters combat. The first whistler lunged, its jagged limb narrowly missing his visor as he parried with the blade, slicing through its limb with a satisfying crack. The second creature circled him, its whistle rising in pitch. Donovan lunged forward, driving the blade into its center, pinning it against a coolant pipe. The creature writhed, its glowing blood hissing as it mixed with the icy coolant spray. The air was thick with the stench of burnt metal and the tang of bioluminescent fluid. The squad fought tooth and nail, their movements precise but desperate. Collins ducked under a slashing limb, firing his sidearm into the creature's exposed underbelly. Keller, despite his injuries, used his bulk to shield Vargas as she reloaded, his heavy rifle a constant roar in the confined space. Donovan engaged one of the larger whistlers, its movements more aggressive than the others. It charged him, its jagged limbs slashing in a deadly rhythm. He sidestepped, using the narrow passage to limit its range of motion. With a powerful swing, he severed one of its limbs, the blade sparking against its exoskeleton. The creature shrieked, a sound that resonated deep in his bones, but he didn't hesitate. A final thrust drove his blade through its core, cutting it almost in half, and it collapsed in a heap. When the last whistler fell, the tunnels were eerily silent. The squad stood among the carnage, their breathing heavy, their armor dented and scorched. Bioluminescent blood pooled around their boots, casting an otherworldly glow on the grim scene. "Status check," Donovan ordered, his voice strained but steady. "Keller's hit, but I've got him patched up," Vargas reported, her tone grim. "He'll live." Collins wiped his visor, smearing the glowing blood across it. "Remind me never to sign up for tunnel duty again," he muttered, holstering his weapon. Donovan surveyed the chamber. The nest was in ruins, the coolant systems damaged but salvageable. He noticed something strange about the whistlers. They were weaker than he'd expected. Their movements had been sluggish, their attacks less coordinated than previous encounters. "They were feeding off the coolant and the catapult's energy," Vargas said, following his gaze. "But it seems like it's messing with them." Donovan replied, his tone dark. "Whatever the case, this isn't over." With the nest destroyed, Donovan radioed the engineers, who began repairs on the coolant systems under heavy guard. The catapult's operations would resume within hours, ensuring the survival of those relying on orbital resupply. Donovan stood at the edge of the chamber, watching as his squad regrouped. Keller leaned against a pipe, his injuries bandaged but still fresh. Vargas and Collins worked together to secure the remaining Whistler parts, their movements efficient despite their exhaustion. The location was finally secured for repairs. Donovan called for them to begin. As the engineers worked, Donovan's thoughts lingered on the fight. The Whistlers' behavior had been different. Less aggressive, more methodical. Was it the coolant affecting them? Or were they evolving in ways he couldn't predict? Keller broke the silence. "Why were they so sluggish? Not that I'm complaining, but it felt off." "Environmental factors?" Vargas suggested. "Maybe the coolant disrupted their systems? Or maybe they were testing us," Donovan said quietly, his eyes fixed on the glowing blood staining the floor. "Whatever it was, we can't let our guard down." The squad packed up their gear, the weight of the mission heavy on their shoulders. As they prepared to leave, Donovan stared at a map of the spine on his HUD. He marked the area as a red zone, a place that would need constant vigilance. "We've got work to do," he muttered, his resolve steeled. The Whistlers were a threat that wouldn't disappear, but neither would he.
Rolling heavy.
The shrill sound of alarms echoed through the steel corridors of the Operation Clean Sweep Command Center. Red lights flashed in rhythmic pulses, casting shadows that flickered like ghosts across the cold metallic walls. The air buzzed with urgency as officers and technicians scrambled between holographic displays. At the heart of the chaos, Cade, Jansen, and Dr. Mertel stood in the briefing chamber. The room was a stark contrast to the frenzy outside. Sterile and eerily quiet, save for the droning voice of Colonel Armitage, their mission commander. His scarred face, illuminated by the pale glow of a holographic map, betrayed no emotion. "Gaian Harmony forces breached the perimeter 20 minutes ago," Armitage began, gesturing to a series of red markers blinking on the map. "Their targets are clear, the orbital launch catapult and the solar array. Both are critical to our operations. If we lose either, it's a death sentence for orbital resupply and energy distribution." Cade crossed his arms. His expression was calm, but his eyes flicked between the markers on the map, calculating angles, distances, and possible choke points. "And us?" he asked, his voice steady, low. Armitage's lips tightened. "Your primary objective is to monitor for Whistler interference. There's no sign of them yet, but we know how they thrive in chaos. If they appear, your orders are to engage immediately." Martell shifted uncomfortably, the tension evident in her pale knuckles gripping the edge of the table. "This zone is crawling with heavy combat units. Are we seriously expecting Whistlers to show up in the middle of this?" she asked, her voice laced with doubt and tinged with dread. Armitage leveled her with a stare. "We've learned the hard way to expect them anywhere." Martell nodded reluctantly, her eyes darting to the screen where environmental data flickered. A cacophony of heat signatures, electromagnetic surges, and movement trackers. Her role was clear. Stay in the mobile command unit and monitor the biological sensors for any sign of Whistler activity. Jansen, leaning casually against the wall, smirked. "So we're babysitting. Easy enough." Armitage's voice hardened. "This is a heavy combat zone, Sergeant. Don't let your guard down. The Gaians are deploying smaller mechs, heavy drones, and teams with anti-armor weaponry. It's not a stroll through the slums." Jansen's grin faded as Cade gave him a sharp look. "We're not here to underestimate anyone," the squad leader reminded him. "Focus." Armitage continued, "There's another variable. You'll rendezvous with an allied mech pilot, Jill Carter, call sign Apollo 3. She's young but seasoned, and her unit will be operating in the debris zone north of the solar array. Mechs are our best option for navigating that terrain." A flicker of concern crossed Cade's face. "What's her status?" "She's effective," Armitage replied curtly, "but she's not invincible. Your job is to ensure no one gets caught off guard. Any further questions?" The room fell silent, the weight of the mission settling like a shroud. Outside, the alarms continued their relentless cry. In the armory, Cade and Jansen suited up in their power armor. Cade's armor, matte black with streaks of dull silver, was a testament to years of service, scarred but reliable. Jansen's, sleek and imposing, was built for heavy firepower, gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights. Martell lingered nearby, securing her headset and checking her data interface. Her exoskeleton, though absent for this mission, had left faint bruises along her arms from recent training. She rubbed them absently, her mind clearly elsewhere. "You good, Doc?" Jansen asked, his tones softer than usual. Martell nodded, but her eyes betrayed her doubt. "Just be careful out there," she said quietly. Cade placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We've got this. Just keep us in the loop." As the squad stepped into the deployment bay, the blast doors groaned open, revealing the war-torn landscape of the spine. The city stretched out before them, a crumbling labyrinth of jagged steel and shattered concrete. In the distance, the solar array shimmered like a mirage, its sleek panels stark against the backdrop of destruction. Jansen hefted his rifle. "Let's roll." Cade's voice cut through the comms, calm and commanding. "Be alert. We're walking into a powder keg." And with that, they moved out, shadows among the ruins, tension crackling in the air like a storm waiting to break. The drop was rough. The transport's descent kicked up a storm of ash and debris as it set down on the outskirts of the spire. The ruined city stretched out before Cade and Jansen, a vast wasteland of collapsed buildings, jagged steel spires, and yawning chasms. The terrain was treacherous, littered with the detritus of decades-long conflict. Smoke curled lazily into the sky from distant fires, and the sporadic crackle of gunfire echoed through the ruins. Enemy forces emerged from the rubble, their shouts drowned out by the roar of gunfire. Small mechs, their frames crude and hastily assembled, stomped forward, engaging Jill's Apollo in a chaotic firefight. The Apollo's 30mm rifle barked again, punching holes through the enemy machines. A salvo of missiles erupted from the mech's pods, streaking across the battlefield and detonating in fiery explosions that lit up the ruins. Cade and Jansen moved with precision through the chaos, flanking enemy positions and cutting down Gaian soldiers. Jansen's heavy weaponry thundered, shredding through cover and forcing the enemy to retreat. Cade's tactical maneuvers kept the pair out of danger, anticipating flanking attempts and neutralizing threats before they could materialize. "Jill, on your left," Cade said over the comms. Jill's mech pivoted smoothly, her rifle spewing tracer rounds that carved through an enemy mech attempting to flank her. The smaller machine crumpled under the assault, collapsing into a heap of smoking metal. "Nice catch," Jill replied, her voice steady. As the firefight raged, Cade's HUD flagged an anomaly. A collapsed building ahead showed unusual heat signatures. He zoomed in, his visor highlighting Gaian soldiers crouched with anti-armor launchers. They were lying in wait, ready to ambush Jill's mech as she moved past. "We've got a problem," Cade muttered. "Anti-armor team, 3 o'clock. They're waiting for..." Jansen grunted. "Guess we're up." The duo moved swiftly, splitting up to flank the ambushers. Cade scaled a pile of rubble, his power armor's servos straining as he hauled himself into position. Below, Jansen stormed forward, his heavy weapon barrels spinning as he laid down suppressive fire. The Gaian soldiers scrambled for cover, their ambush unraveling. One of the soldiers fired a rocket, the projectile streaking toward Jill's mech. She reacted instantly, sidestepping the blast with practiced ease. The missile exploded harmlessly against a pile of rubble. "That was close," Jill said, her mech's rifle swiveling to return fire. The Gaian team was obliterated in a hail of high-caliber rounds. Cade dropped down from his perch, dispatching the remaining soldiers with precision shots. Jansen moved to cover him, his weapon roaring as he cleared the area. "All clear," Cade reported, his breathing heavy. "Jill, you're good to move?" "Appreciate it," Jill replied, her mech stepping over the wreckage. "You two aren't half bad." But there was no time for celebration. The sound of more engines echoed through the ruins, signaling reinforcements. The battlefield roared with commotion as Jill's Apollo squared off against 2 enemy mechs. The first was a sleek insect-like scout, its rapid-fire cannons peppering her with bursts of suppressive fire. The second was a towering brawler, its reinforced frame bristling with melee weapons and crude oversized armor. Each step it took shook the ground beneath it, an ominous prelude to the battle ahead. Jill's voice crackled through the comms, her tone razor-sharp. "Cade, Jansen, keep the grunts off me. I've got these tin cans." The scout mech darted to her left, its movements quick. Jill rotated the Apollo, but the bulky machine struggled to track the smaller target. The scout weaved through rubble, firing bursts that struck her shoulder-mounted missile pods. Sparks flew as the Apollo's armor absorbed the impacts, but Jill knew she couldn't let it keep its advantage. "Drones on that scout," she commanded. Her escort drones sprang to life, swarming toward the scout mech. They flitted around the enemy, disrupting its targeting systems with precision shots. The scout's movements became erratic, forced into defensive maneuvers. Jill capitalized on the opening, firing a high-explosive round that clipped the mech's side, sending it skittering behind cover. Meanwhile, the brawler mech advanced methodically, its heavy frame crushing debris underfoot. It raised one massive claw-like arm, and Jill braced herself. The Apollo's missile pod swiveled toward the threat, but a burst of fire from the scout mech forced her to divert her aim. "Jansen, take the legs on the scout," Jill shouted. Jansen's heavy weapon roared to life. Positioned on higher ground, he lined up his shot and fired high-explosive rounds. The shell tore through the scout mech's right leg, sending it sprawling. The machine writhed as its system struggled to compensate. "Nice shot," Cade's voice came over the comms. "I'll keep the infantry busy." Cade moved swiftly through the rubble, his power armor a blur of motion as he dispatched Gaian soldiers attempting to flank Jill. He fired his rifle in controlled bursts, cutting down enemies before they could take up positions. With the scout mech disabled, Jill turned her focus to the brawler. It charged forward, its clawed arms outstretched. The Apollo's 30mm rifle spat a flurry of rounds, each one slamming into the brawler's chest plate. The enemy mech staggered, but didn't slow, its sheer mass and armor soaking the damage. The impact came like a freight train. The brawler slammed into the Apollo, its claw digging into Jill's mech's side. Alarms blared in her cockpit as the two machines grappled, metal grinding against metal. Jill grit her teeth, her hands flying over the controls as she fought to free her mech. "You're not getting me that easy," she growled. The brawler raised its other arm, preparing to bring it down on the Apollo's cockpit. Jill fired her missile pods at point-blank range. The explosion rocked both mechs, sending the brawler stumbling backward. Its armor, though thick, showed massive scorch marks and exposed wiring. "Jansen, Cade, I could use a hand here," Jill yelled. Kay turned his attention to the brawler, laying down suppressive fire to keep Gaian infantry at bay. "On it!" "Jansen, flank that thing." Jansen moved to the brawler's side, his weapon trained on its exposed joints. He fired a precision round that shattered the servo in its left leg, forcing the mech to one knee. Jill seized the moment, wrenching the Apollo free and slamming her rifle stock into the brawler's damaged knee joint. The massive enemy mech toppled, crashing to the ground in a cloud of dust and sparks. Jill didn't hesitate. She leveled the Apollo's missile pods and unleashed a final salvo. The missiles struck the brawler's cockpit, reducing it to a smoldering wreck. The battlefield fell eerily silent as the last of the enemy forces retreated, their remaining mechs dragging themselves back through the ruins. Jill slumped back in her cockpit seat, her breath ragged. Her Apollo mech was battered and scorched, its once formidable armor marred by gashes and burn marks. Cade and Jansen regrouped with her, their power armor similarly scarred from the fight. Cade glanced at the wreckage around them, his rifle still at the ready. "We secure?" "For now," Jill replied, her voice tinged with exhaustion. "But they'll be back." Jansen walked up to the Apollo's battered leg, tapping it with a gauntleted fist. "This thing has some real firepower." As the team surveyed the carnage, a faint mechanical whine echoed through the ruins. Jill's drones buzzed around them, scanning for any remaining threats. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid stench of burnt circuitry. "Let's not stick around to see if they regroup," Cade said. "We need to check in with Martel." Jill ordered her drones to return to their docks. The trio moved out, leaving the smoldering battlefield behind. It was quieter now, the echoes of gunfire and clashing metal replaced by the hum of operational drones and the distant crackle of flames from wrecked enemy mechs. The air hung heavy with the stench of scorched metal and ozone, a reminder of the brutal combat that had just unfolded. Cade, Jansen, and Jill stood amidst the rubble, their war-torn figures framed by the skeletal remains of the spire's outer ruins. Martel's voice crackled through their comms. "Whistler activity still reads as 0, but I'm not liking the energy readings from that solar array. There's residual interference. Gaian Tech might have planted something." "Noted," Cade replied, his tone clipped as he scanned the horizon through his helmet's enhanced optics. "Jansen, check the perimeter. Jill, can your drones confirm there's no sabotage we missed?" Jill, still in her battered Apollo mech, activated her remaining drones. They buzzed out in formation, scanning the solar array and its surrounding infrastructure. She watched the feeds on her cockpit display, her eyes narrowing at every flicker of potential movement. "Nothing major yet," she said, "but they left some debris that could be traps. Might need a sweep team to clean this up." Moments later, the engineers arrived, convoying in armored vehicles. They set to work under the watchful gaze of Cade and Jansen, repairing the solar array and stabilizing the catapult systems. Every clang of their tools seemed unnaturally loud in the aftermath of the battle. "They're exposed," Jansen muttered, his weapon still at the ready. "If the Gaians have reinforcements waiting." "They won't," Cade interrupted. "Not after the beating they just took. But we're not leaving until we're sure." Jill powered down the Apollo and climbed out, her limbs stiff as she removed her helmet. Sweat plastered her hair to her forehead, and her expression was one of exhaustion. The mech loomed behind her like a silent sentinel. Cade approached her, his power armor clinking softly with each step. "Good work out there," he said, his voice low but steady. "Your piloting made the difference." Jill gave a tired smile, sitting on a piece of rubble. "Difference or not, it's the same fight every time. They hit, we hit back. Just another cycle of destruction." "Welcome to the Spire," Cade replied, lowering himself to sit beside her. "Survivors don't get to stop fighting." Jill glanced at him, her expression softening. "You don't strike me as the motivational type." "I'm not," Cade said bluntly, "but I know how to keep people moving. Sometimes that's all we've got." In the mobile command unit, Martel's brow furrowed as she analyzed the battlefield data. Her findings confirmed what she'd feared. Traces of luster had been found on the bodies of the Gaian soldiers. The drug's eerie bioluminescent signature glowed faintly in their veins, even in death. Martel's voice cut into the squad's comms. "Cade, we need to talk about luster. If the Gaians are using Whistler-derived substances, we could be looking at a deeper connection between them and those creatures. This wasn't just a terrorist attack. There's more to it." Jansen's voice broke in. "So what, they're teaming up with the bugs now?" "We can't rule it out," Martel replied, her tone grim. "And if they are, we're in more trouble than we thought." Cade stood, his gaze locked on the ruins. "We'll deal with it. For now, let's get this site secure. Jansen, check in with the engineers. Jill, see if your drones can do one more sweep." Jill nodded, slipping her helmet back on and heading for her mech. Jansen moved toward the engineers, his heavy weapon still at the ready. As the team began their final preparations to leave, the weight of the mission settled on them. The Gaians' retreat felt temporary, and the unease about their connection to the Whistlers lingered like a dark cloud. He marked the area on his map for future patrols, knowing they'd likely be back before long. The team regrouped at the extraction point, leaving the ruins behind, but the questions and dangers they uncovered followed them every step of the way. The extraction point was near a half-destroyed overpass overlooking the spire. The sun hung low, its rays casting long shadows over the city. The team stood in tense silence as engineers packed up their tools, the faint hum of drone activity buzzing in the distance. Cade's voice cut through the static of the comms. "Jansen, give me a final sweep report." "All clear, boss," Jansen replied, his heavy weapon resting across his chest. "No movement on sensors. Gaians are gone." Martel chimed in from the command unit. "Same here. No signs of Whistler activity either, but those luster readings still bother me." Cade nodded. A deep rumble rolled through the earth beneath them. Dust and debris rattled loose from nearby structures. Jill, back in her Apollo mech, snapped her rifle into position, scanning the area. "Earthquake?" she asked, her voice tense. "Not likely," Martel said sharply. "The catapult isn't active yet, and seismic sensors didn't pick up anything." The rumbling grew louder, and suddenly, with a deafening crash, a section of the ground near the engineers collapsed. Chunks of asphalt and reinforced concrete tumbled into the void, leaving behind a jagged hole that exhaled a blast of cool, stale air. Cade was the first to move, signaling the team to hold their positions. He approached the edge of the newly formed crater cautiously, his rifle at the ready. A deep, dark tunnel stretched downward into the earth, its walls rough but precise. Freshly dug. "Martel, I need eyes on this," Cade said. A drone, sleek and silent, zipped over the hole and descended into the darkness. Its floodlights illuminated the tunnel, revealing claw marks along the walls. The footage streamed back to Martel's monitor, her face growing pale as she processed what she was seeing. Martel's voice trembled as she spoke. "Those claw marks. This tunnel wasn't made by humans. It's Whistler work. Recent, too." Jansen's voice crackled over the comms. "So, what? The Gaians found one of these tunnels and just used it to waltz right in?" "That's exactly what it looks like," Martel replied grimly. "The Whistlers dig and the Gaians take advantage. We've been worried about Whistlers in the depths and Gaians on the surface, but now they're overlapping." Cade clenched his fists, his mind racing. "Martel, Get me a depth reading on that tunnel. How far does it go? The drone's sensors pinged back a result. Martel's voice carried a note of disbelief. It stretches at least a kilometer and connects to the main water network. From there, it's anyone's guess. Perfect, Jill muttered bitterly, as if this place wasn't a big enough mess already. Kate stepped back from the edge, his gaze fixed on the tunnel. We've been treating the Gaians and Whistlers like separate problems, but if this keeps up, we'll be fighting on two fronts, above and below. Jensen sighed heavily. And here I thought we'd get to breathe after this mission. No chance, Cade said, his tone hard. This changes everything. We need to map these tunnels and figure out how deep this goes. The drone's feed suddenly flickered, the screen turning to static. Martel's hands flew over the controls. I lost it. The drone's signal just... A low melodic whistle drifted up from the tunnel, faint but unmistakable. The team froze, the sound sending chills down their spines. Whistlers, Cade said, his voice like steel. We can't take them on without a resupply. Let's get out of here. The return trip to base was one of thoughtful silence.
Operation Downfall.
The maintenance elevator groaned and shuddered as it descended into the earth, its rusted steel frame carrying the weight of 30 power-armored Marines and their MRAP vehicle. It was a large platform for moving industrial equipment. The air was thick with the metallic tang of old machinery, and the faint pungent stench of decayed matter rising from the depths below. The flickering, dim overhead lights painted erratic shadows on the corroded walls of the shaft, and faded graffiti told stories of previous ventures into the tunnels, stories that often ended in failure or death. Lieutenant Marcus Trask stood near the front, gripping the rail with one armored hand, his helmet maglocked to his side. His dark, sharp eyes scanned his squad, reading their expressions beneath the muted hum of anticipation. Each Marine carried his own burden into this mission, but Trask's weighed heavier than most. Operation Clean Sweep, the failed surface-level assault on the Whistlers, had left scars. On the soldiers, on the chain of command, and on humanity's waning hope this could be ended quickly. This was supposed to be their redemption. The walls of the shaft, pockmarked with scorch marks and etched names, seemed to whisper warnings of what lay ahead. The tension was palpable, but Trask's voice cut through it, calm and firm. Stay sharp. This isn't Clean Sweep. We're better prepared, better armed. This time we hit them where it hurts. Staff Sergeant Morales stood at his side, arms crossed over his chest plate, exuding a quiet confidence that steadied the younger soldiers. "You heard the lieutenant," he said, his voice steady but edged with steel. "Focus on your gear, your squad, and the mission. Everything else is noise." The squad was a mix of hardened veterans and green recruits, their faces varying between grim resolve and the nervous energy of first-time combat. Private Grant, the youngest of the group, shifted uneasily, gripping his weapon with white-knuckled hands. His rookie nerves hadn't gone unnoticed. "Relax, kid," said Specialist Brick, a demolitions expert whose heavy combat frame dwarfed Grant's wiry build. Brick's voice carried a gruff humor that somehow cut through the oppressive atmosphere. "Stick close to me, and I'll make sure you don't blow yourself up. Or anyone else, for that matter." Corporal Smith leaned against the wall, his scout helmet already in place, the reflective visor hiding his calculating gaze. "Keep your eyes open, Grant," he said. "These tunnels aren't just dark. They're alive. You won't see them coming until they're already on you." Grant nodded stiffly, swallowing hard. "Yes, Corporal." The MRAP rumbled quietly as it took up most of the elevator's center, its rugged frame bristling with mounted weapons and reinforced armor. Specialist Gunner Rains sat atop it, his shoulder mount railgun humming faintly as it cycled through a pre-deployment diagnostic. He caught Trask's eye and gave a slight nod. "Ready when you are, LT." As the elevator plunged deeper, Trask initiated the mission briefing. "Our objective is simple," he began, his voice carrying a weight that silenced the faint chatter. "We're clearing a path to the central cavern. That's where they're nesting. Expect tight quarters, ambushes, and resistance unlike anything we've seen topside." He paused, letting the gravity of his words sink in before continuing. "Other squads are approaching from different directions, but we can't count on them. Once we're in, comms are likely to go dark. You'll be relying on the soldier next to you. And that's enough. We've trained for this." A wave of tension flared as he mentioned the reports of whistlers armed with spike-shooting weapons. "These firearms aren't widespread, but they're dangerous. Keep your formation tight, and don't let them pin you down. Morales, you'll manage the advance. Brick, keep the path clear and set charges where necessary." Brick grinned, slapping a heavy satchel charge dangling from his belt. "Always happy to bring the fireworks, sir." The Marines exchanged grim smiles and muted chuckles, the gallows humor a small reprieve from the oppressive tension. The camaraderie was palpable, forged through shared hardship and the unspoken understanding that not all of them would return. As the elevator slowed to a screeching halt, the squad fell into silence, their visors snapping into place with a hiss. The dim light of the elevator was swallowed by the darkness beyond, and a low, melodic whistle echoed faintly from the tunnels ahead, a haunting sound that sent a chill through even the most battle-hardened among them. Trask took a deep breath and donned his helmet, his voice steady as he gave the final order. "Weapons hot, let's move." The doors screeched open, revealing the jagged maw of the tunnel network. Bioluminescent slime lined the walls, casting an eerie, pale green glow that danced across the Marine's armor. The air was damp and heavy, thick with the scent of decay. Somewhere in the darkness, the whistlers waited. As the squad filed out, their boots crunching against the stone floor, Trask glanced back at the elevator one last time. The rusted machinery groaned and sputtered as it ascended, leaving them behind. "Time to finish what we started," he muttered, gripping his weapon tightly as he led his Marines into the abyss. The squad advanced cautiously, their power armor humming softly with each step. The MRAP rumbled behind them, its thick wheels barely squeezing through the jagged, winding tunnels. The walls seemed to press inward, closing the soldiers into a claustrophobic labyrinth. Water dripped steadily from above, splattering against armor and pooling on the uneven ground. The air was thick, damp, and carried a faint, nauseating odor, like rotting meat left too long in a sealed container. Trask took point, his eyes scanning the dim glow of the tunnel ahead. The bioluminescent slime coating the walls pulsed faintly, casting shifting shadows that played tricks on the eye. It was as though the tunnels themselves were alive, breathing, and waiting to close in around them. "Eyes sharp," Trask said over the squad's comms. "These corners are perfect ambush points." Behind him, Brick adjusted the satchel charge strapped to his chest. "This place gives me the creeps," he muttered. "Feels like it's waiting for us to screw up." "Focus, Brick," Staff Sergeant Morales barked, his voice steady. "Keep your explosives ready, but no itchy trigger finger." The tunnel twisted sharply, forcing the MRAP to inch through the tight space. The Marines moved in disciplined formation, scanning every crevice, every shadow, their weapons raised and ready. The attack came without warning. From a crack in the wall, a whistler burst out, its jagged claws slashing toward the lead Marine. Trask reacted instantly, his rifle firing a burst of rounds that tore into the creature's chest. It screeched as it collapsed, its bioluminescent blood splattering across the tunnel floor. More shots followed until it stopped moving. "Ambush!" Morales shouted. The walls came alive with movement as more whistlers poured from hidden crevices. Their bodies gleamed faintly in the dim light, their melodic whistles rising in pitch to a frenzied symphony. The Marines fired in controlled bursts, and flamethrowers ignited the narrow space with searing heat. Brick grinned grimly as he slammed a charge against a weak section of the tunnel wall. "Cover your ears, boys," he called out, detonating the explosive. The wall collapsed in a shower of rock and debris, sealing off one of the Whistler's entry points and forcing the others into the squad's line of fire. It would take them a long time to dig out of that. Corporal Smith, stationed near the rear, called out a warning, "Spikes incoming!" From a side tunnel, a Whistler emerged, its grotesque limbs cradling a crude weapon that fired jagged black spikes. The projectiles ricocheted off the walls, one striking a Marine in the shoulder joint. The soldier cried out, stumbling back as the rest of the squad focused their fire, shredding the Whistler before it could reload. Trask cursed under his breath. "Keep moving, stay in cover." The squad pressed forward, their progress slowed by the relentless ambushes. Flamethrowers roared to life, filling the air with the acrid stench of burning flesh. Raines's railgun let out a deafening crack, punching through a cluster of Whistlers and leaving smoldering holes in the wall behind them. As the squad pushed deeper into the maze-like tunnels, the attacks became more sporadic but no less dangerous. The Whistlers seemed to adapt, attacking from unexpected angles and exploiting the terrain. Narrow choke points forced the Marines to abandon the MRAP temporarily, its bulk too unwieldy to navigate the tighter passages. They had to use brute force and a little bit of explosives to clear the way. "I've got movement up ahead, Sykes," the drone operator said, his fingers flying over the controls. "Looks like a larger group gathering near the next turn." Trask nodded. "Brick said a charge. We'll flush 'em out." Brick moved quickly, lobbing a grenade into the center of the Whistler cluster. The squad took cover as the charge detonated, the concussive sending debris hurtling toward the hidden Whistlers. A few managed to emerge from the rubble, but they were cut down in a hail of gunfire. The tunnel grew darker as they pressed on, the bioluminescent slime thinning out and leaving vast stretches of oppressive blackness. The Marines activated their helmet lights, the beams slicing through the shadows but doing little to dispel the unease. The squad's march through the tunnels continued, their nerves frayed by the persistent attacks and the suffocating atmosphere. Every step deeper into the labyrinth brought them closer to the hive and the unknown horrors waiting for them in the dark. Every sound was amplified, the scrape of boots on stone, the soft hum of power armor systems, and the rhythmic drip of water echoing endlessly through the darkness. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed down the tunnel, a deep, resonant boom that seemed to shake the very air. It was followed by the faint, melodic whistle that had haunted them since the descent. The sound was sharp, deliberate, and unnervingly close, then faded. The Marines froze in place, their visors snapping to full amplification, cutting through the murky dimness ahead. Weapons raised, they scanned the tunnel, fingers hovering over triggers. "Movement," Smith said, his voice barely above a whisper. His rifle tracked a shadow, flickering just out of sight. A shape darted across the tunnel ahead, quick as a blur, then another. The Whistlers were circling them, probing their defenses, but didn't attack. Every Marine could feel it. The enemy was testing them, waiting for the moment to strike. "They're playing with us," Trask muttered, his voice laced with quiet fury. "Stay close. No one strays." The Marines tightened their formation, stepping deliberately to avoid leaving gaps in their line. The near silence only deepened the tension, broken intermittently by the faint rustling of unseen creatures. Every step forward felt heavier than the last, as though the tunnel itself were resisting their passage. As they moved forward, the faint echoes of distant combat filtered through the tunnel, the staccato bursts of gunfire and the muted booms of explosions. It was a grim reminder that they weren't alone in the fight, but it also carried a warning of the chaos awaiting them in the cavern ahead. "Stay alert and watch your surroundings," Trask said, his voice low but steady, cutting through the rising unease like a blade. "We're getting closer." The tunnel finally opened into a larger passage, its walls slick with bioluminescent residue that pulsed faintly in the near darkness. Each man's armor was streaked with grime and alien fluids, their weapons smeared with the viscera of the creatures they had already fought. Trask stepped forward, scanning the terrain ahead as he signaled for the squad to prepare for the next stage of the mission. The Marines moved cautiously down the tunnel, the narrow passage opening into a void of staggering proportions. The bioluminescent glow of Whistler's secretions illuminated the massive chamber ahead, a sprawling hive built into the bones of the earth itself. It stretched hundreds of feet in all directions, vast pillars of scavenged material spiraling toward the high ceiling. Distant flashes of gunfire and explosions threw violent shadows across the walls, highlighting the frenetic battle already raging within. Trask held up a clenched fist, signaling the squad to halt. The air was thick with the smell of spent munitions, the staccato echo of weapons fire reverberating through the cavern like an unrelenting drumbeat. "Eyes on the fight ahead," Trask barked over the squad's comms, his voice steadied despite the chaos. "We're going in hot. No room for mistakes." Beyond the lip of the cavern entrance, other Marine squads were already engaged in brutal combat. Whistlers poured out of the hive's labyrinthine walls and pillars like a living flood, their bodies writhing in endless waves. Amid the chaos, larger whistlers, some nearly 20 feet tall, charged through the melee, their reinforced exoskeletons deflecting smaller arms' fire as they crushed Marines beneath massive clawed limbs. Trask's squad moved forward in disciplined formation, their power armor gleaming dully in the greenish glow. The MRAP's turrets swiveled to life, spitting a barrage of heavy rounds into the closest cluster of whistlers. The impact shredded through smaller drones, spraying ichor across the cavern floor. "Form up. Heavy hitters focus fire on the big ones," Trask shouted. "Brick, get those charges set along the flanks." The swarm responded with animalistic fury, their haunting melodic whistles rising in pitch as they flanked and surged. One particularly massive whistler, bristling with extra spines, charged headlong into a cluster of Marines. Its claws scythed through armor, sending sparks and blood flying as soldiers were thrown like ragdoll. Sergeant Morales shouted, his voice tight with urgency. "Focus fire. Drop it before it wipes us out." Gunner Rains pivoted his railgun, the weapon letting out a deafening crack as a hypervelocity round slammed into the creature's torso. The impact staggered it but didn't bring it down. Fire erupted as another Marine let loose with a flamethrower, the searing heat forcing the beast back toward one of Brick's charges. "Clear the blast zone!" Brick yelled as he slammed his detonator. The satchel charge erupted with a concussive blast, collapsing part of the hive wall and sending the Queen team toppling into a pile of rubble. Smaller whistlers, stunned by the blast, were quickly picked off by a coordinated volley from the squad. Amid the chaos, Trask scanned the battlefield, his HUD mapping friendlies and hostiles as best it could through the electromagnetic interference. "Ortiz, on me," he called. "We're pushing left to support Red Squad. They're pinned near the central pillar." Sergeant Ortiz hefted his minigun with a feral grin, the barrels already spinning as he unleashed a relentless hail of fire into the advancing whistlers. The squad surged forward, cutting a path through the swarming whistlers. The central pillar loomed ahead, its surface crawling with drones and molting chambers. Red Squad's position was barely holding, their Marines firing desperately from behind makeshift cover. "Red Squad, this is Trask. We're flanking the swarm. Hold the line." Trask's voice cut through the static, and the embattled Marines rallied at the sound of reinforcements. Explosions thundered as the MRAP's missile pods fired into the densely packed whistlers near the pillar, sending chunks of exoskeleton and glowing ichor raining down. The squad pushed forward, their combined firepower forcing the whistlers to retreat deeper into the hive. The cavern shook suddenly, a low rumble reverberating through the stone as another large bug emerged from the far side of the chamber. This one was bigger and more grotesque than the last, its spines crackling faintly with energy. It let out a bone-chilling screech that sent the remaining drones into a frenzy. "Another one!" Grant shouted, his voice breaking with panic. "Get it together, Private," Morales snapped. "We don't have a choice," Trask replied grimly. "Focus all heavy weapons on that thing." The squad regrouped, forming a tight defensive line as the Queen charged. Rains fired round after round from his railgun, each shot chipping away at the creature's armor. Ortiz's minigun roared to life once more, its barrels glowing red-hot as they tore into its flank. It finally went down, a Marine impaled on its finger claws. The battle reached a fever pitch, the cavern alive with fire, blood, and the unrelenting sound of the whistlers. Trask moved through the chaos like a man possessed, shouting orders, rallying his Marines, and firing into the swarm with deadly accuracy. "Push them back," Trask roared. "Don't let up." With the last of their strength, the Marines forced the swarm into the far tunnels. The creatures pushed into darkness. The battlefield remained alive with chaos even after the Queen fell. The Whistlers, seemingly undeterred by the loss of their monstrous leaders, fought with unrelenting ferocity, though their numbers had been greatly diminished. Their bioluminescent blood streaked the walls, casting eerie, flickering light across the cavern as if the hive itself were alive and thrashing. The Marines' weapons thundered on, their relentless barrage echoing through the vast chamber like war drums. The Whistlers faltered, their numbers dwindling as their dead piled high. Slowly they began to retreat, their spindly forms skittering into tunnels too narrow for human pursuit. Their melodic whistles grew fainter and fainter until they were nothing more than echoes in the oppressive silence. The cavern fell still, save for the labored breathing of the Marines and the faint hiss of burning Whistler corpses. The bioluminescent slime lining the walls dimmed, plunging the space into an uneasy gloom. Trask lowered his weapon, his shoulders sagging with exhaustion. The battle was over, for now. The Marines wasted no time. Moving with grim efficiency, they destroyed any remaining molting chambers with flamethrowers and explosives. The grotesque structures pulsated faintly, their alien forms bursting into oozing piles with each detonation. The stench of burning biomass filled the air thick and acrid as the squad purged the hive of any lingering threats. Brick approached Trask, his armor streaked with gore. "Got most of the side tunnels sealed off," he reported. "If they try coming back, they'll have to dig their way through." "Good," Trask replied, his voice hollow but resolute. His eyes lingered on the fallen Marines scattered across the battlefield, their power armor scarred and battered. He forced the grief down, bearing it beneath the weight of his responsibility. "Let's finish this." The squad, though battered and thinned, pressed on, securing the cavern and sealing the last of the Whistler's strongholds. Their victory was hard won, but its cost was written in the blood of their comrades and the scars etched into their soul. Of the 30 Marines who had entered the tunnels, over a third were now dead or critically injured. The once formidable squad was now a battered shadow of its former self, their ranks thinned by the relentless carnage of the hive. Medics moved among the wounded, their voices low but urgent as they tended to shattered limbs and leaking power suits. The stench of blood and burning alien flesh hung heavy in the cavern. Nearby, Sykes was crouched over a damaged recon drone, his gloved hands deftly manipulating the controls as he struggled to extract whatever data the device still held. Sykes's armor was caked in grime, the faint glow of his suit's tactical interface flickering against the cavern's dim bioluminescent light. He straightened, his gaze sweeping over the battlefield. The remaining Marines were scattered throughout the cavern, their armor scorched and scarred, their movements weary but purposeful as they secured the hive and gathered their dead. The faces behind their visors were hidden, but Trask could feel the weight of their exhaustion, their grief, their unspoken questions about what would come next. Trask's voice cut through the oppressive silence as he addressed his squad. "We took the fight to them," he said, his tone steady despite the heaviness in his chest. "And we won. But this isn't over, not by a long shot." The Marines turned to him, their resolve clear in the way they carried themselves, despite their injuries and the grim scene surrounding them. They were battered, bloodied, but unbroken. The fight had cost them dearly, but it had also forged their determination into something stronger, something unyielding. As the remaining team prepared for extraction, the oppressive silence of the cavern settled over them like a shroud. The faint whistling sounds of retreating bugs echoed in the distance, a haunting reminder of the enemy still lurking in the shadows.
Enjoy this story? Subscribe to Free Science Fiction Stories for daily sci-fi adventures.